His hand was steady, the aim down his arm as rigid as a lance. The man on the end of it did not plead for his life, did not appeal for mercy or even rationality. It was that, among a handful of other things, which enabled 1313 to spare his life, at least for the moment. It may not have seemed to matter a great deal. They were all going to die before this was over. But there was a significant difference between death in the line of duty and death as a form of execution. The young man was not this flesh. He was not this body that held him. He was duty, and he was the honor of Krieg, and even more than that, he was a sinner. He was born a sinner. His mother a machine of contrivance, his father's the duality which raged within him. Chairman Vinsark, Colonel Yurton, both bearing the tattered standards of his origin within his flesh, and more importantly, within his soul. He was penance caging sin, a contrition to last 100,000 generations. His blood was filthy, and only duty and death within that duty could cleanse him of that impurity. He was unworthy of life. He had known this since his eyes first opened. He lived only to die. That was the ultimate truth of the sons of Krieg. For Krieg had sinned, and that sin was in him, as well as the will to redeem it.
13, please don't do this,
she begged him, not pleadingly, not pathetically, but desperately. Straight as his arm was, so too was the long lass pointed directly into the side of his head. But it was not the fear of death that affected him in those moments, and she was begging to save his own life as much as that of her captain. The words, spoken by Corporal Emiliana, stung him deeply, quaked him to his core. But that core was buried deep and held firm in a grasp as cold and rigid as the bunkers of his homeworld. The tremors she sent to that place could not, reach to the surface, and no sign of his pain reflected on the bare face of the 15-year-old soldier. Nothing she could say would change the need for his duty to be done. General Order 99 was absolute, and it was not for him to choose his superiors nor to judge their orders. Commissar Shadrick was what he was who he was, and both of those things were a Captain Commissar who had been sent to this place to take command of the Guard. Though for a time he had entertained that Lazarus as a saint could hold command, that illusion could only stand until challenged. The edicts born of the Reign of Blood left no room for interpretation. There was no place for the ecclesiarchy within the command structure of the Astera Militarum. This was law. And, if not a saint, then Saint Lazarus was not but a sergeant, and a sergeant could not challenge a commissar captain. The orders were clear. The chain of command was clear. The place where his duty lay was clear. But that did not mean that carrying it out did not pain him, nor that Emiliana's pleas did not cut him. To the contrary, and to his great surprise, they cut him deeply. The look in the eyes of the Cadians, who themselves were restrained by orders given, bore into him in a way he had never expected to feel. It all hurt terribly. He had felt pain, felt the dying of his flesh. Even now, he lacked an eye taken by Republic blaster fire. Even now, he lacked an arm shorn from him by mechanical mercy. Even now, his wretched body was spotted by a million bruises and scrapes, burns and cuts. But he had never felt this pain before. It was new. It was a penance, he tried to tell himself, but it did not feel that way. It felt like a punishment.
13, answer me! We shed blood together. We fought the replicate together. I saved your life, and you saved mine. The least you owe me is an answer!
She demanded again. He tried to. He opened his mouth, but suddenly realized he could not speak. He knew the words. They were in his mind even now. Matter-of-fact answers, as logical as math. General Order 99 had been issued. The Commissar claimed the authority of the Inquisition. All further thoughts were worthless. All further action, heretical. It should have been so easy to say. But as he looked into the back of Captain Stern's head, his pistol pressed against it, even as the man kneeled on the ground before him, Corpsman 1313 found he was at the very edge of his strength, and he hadn't even realized it until now. He could not look away. His eye, his intact eye, hurt, his vision fogging. What was this pain? This weakness? His hand was almost trembling. His heart was beating faster than it should. Was he sick? Was he cursed? Corporal, you will be silent, or you will be kneeling alongside the former captain. I'll have your honor stripped from you, and your shame will carry to your family and sisters in the Scola. Do not make me address you again, said the Commissar, who, even then, was approaching Stern, his face scrunched in an attempt to hide his ugly smile. It was not a successful attempt. 1313 said nothing, even as he felt another sting strike him, this time from the Commissar. Again, it was something he should not have felt, and he puzzled over the burning sensation in his chest as the aftermath of the words settled in. Anger? Insult? He was taking offense for Emiliana, a person who was not even he himself, a person who was not even from Krieg. Why?
13. I didn't know you were a coward,
came the rueful whisper from the corporal, incited by his own silence, and another lance of painful emotion shot through him, moving like a ghost's own hand and ignoring his coat, armor, and uniform. Whether or not Shadrach heard her was unclear, as he was distracted a moment later as Sergeant Vett approached, his gun discarded and laying on the ground, showing he was no threat as he neared. Instead, in his hand was a short-range Vox receiver and broadcaster, the green, squat, blocky device raised forward as he walked. Far enough, said the Commissar Captain, and one of his remaining men aimed a gun at Vett, who froze, but continued to hold the Vox out. It's a message for you, sir. Message for the man in command. Vetnex reported, and his phrasing, more than anything else, purchased the man his chance. Shadrach smirked and jerked his head forward, the man aiming the weapon at Vex coming closer and snatching the device from his hand, moving back towards Shadrach once he had confirmed it was not some kind of hidden explosive. I am not a coward. I do not fear death, 1313 managed to say as this played out before them, keeping his voice strong and even, but low. He wanted to look at her as he said it, but he couldn't. His muscles were bunched too tightly at his neck. His heart was beating painfully. Every beat was like a pump of cool, yet searing poison, acting as an internal demand. A demand that he simply die right here and right now, and yet, why? He could not understand it, this pain that now assailed him without wounding. All around him, he was doing no different from all of his brothers, all soldiers of sin fighting to die in order to restore the honor of Krieg and the almighty God Emperor. The silent men of Krieg stood in ranks, guns aimed, unafraid of potential return fire as they targeted the Cadians in the room. The other Imperial soldiers aimed right back at them, though most did so from cover. Yet none on either side fired, all obeying orders of a kind. Did the other corpsmen, his brothers in every way, not feel this pain as well? Did their hearts not ache as his did? And why? Why did it hurt at all?
No, you don't fear death. You run towards it. You crave it like a shard addict,
Emiliana continued to say, voice whispering angrily.
That is what makes you cowards. You are so afraid, so unwilling to use what the Emperor has given us all, that you cannot wait to die,"
she said, her long lass still aimed into the side of his head. The Vox communicator was delivered to Shadrach, and he placed it to his ear, pressing the right button as he did to accept the communication.
"This is Captain Commissar Shadrach, in command of the Astra Militarum forces at the Basilica of Salvation. What is your report?"
he said into it. The Commissar was not prepared for the booming reply that came out from the device, which Vetnex had set to its loudest, speaker-like setting prior to handing it over. A setting the Commissar had been unable to anticipate. In truth, it was more unexpected than loud, but in the tense silence of the room, it rung out clearly so that all could hear. "This is St. Lazarus! The angels of death are here! The Emperor's angels have descended! We are all retreating back to the Basilica right now! Commissar, I need you to prepare said the grainy but recognizable voice of the newly anointed Imperial Saint. Shadrach did not listen to much of it, dropping the Vox and crushing it with a powerful stomp of his armored boot. "I do not take orders from a sergeant," the Commissar snarled contemptuously. "You, Vetnex, back in line," he added, pointing a crooked finger at the sergeant, whose face creased but nodded, doing as he was ordered to.
"Commissar,"
said a Krieger who stood nearby. "What is your number, soldier?" Shadrach snapped back. The Krieger raised his gun barrel as he hefted it and saluted.
1541, sir,"
the masked man said. "What do you want, 1541? asked the Commissar Captain.
"Permission to voice an opinion, sir,"
requested 1521. "Permission denied. Resume your duty," ordered Shadrach, and the Krieger nodded without hesitation and resumed aiming his weapon. The instant obedience brought a smile to Shadrach, helping him recover his mood and resuming his approach before he was standing above Captain Stern. Before long, Commissar Shadrach was kneeling, stripping Captain Stern of his weapon and sidearm, holstering his own gun to heft Stern's glowing plasma pistol. Akkadian relic. 1313 could not see the man's face, but he knew it must be fixed in an unpleasant expression as he silently endured the humiliation.
"You are terrified of sinning. You are terrified of doing anything but dying. You are terrified of the price of living,"
Emiliana continued to hiss.
"You are so afraid that all of you, your entire regiment, is jumping at the first chance to murder yourselves. All because that man has given you the authority to be what you were trained to be. Cowards! We haven't lost yet. The God Emperor sent back St. Lazarus to save us. He promised that help was coming, and it is. But you have no real faith. Just a death wish that you think will absolve you,"
she accused him. These words stung worst of all, because deep within, he knew they were true, and that truth was surfacing like some hideous beast from the ocean of his spirit. How he longed to be freed of his fear, to finally enter death, to be granted grace and forgiveness by the loss of his own life, to become incapable of wrongdoing, to finally be judged for this test, this cursed life, to at long last be over. No one had ever called it fear before, but it was. Yet now there was something else taking root inside him, rising as the Commissar rose with his new trophy.
"This is the definition of the easy way out. You don't fear pain or injury. You fear your own free will, your Emperor-given mind. You're terrified of it just because it might lead you to a mistake. You ignore the fact that every single Imperial hero didn't allow themselves the luxury of an easy death. They were brave enough to think they dared sin and found salvation. They did it in the face of death because they knew that even an easy death is..."
Emiliana was saying, her voice now dripping fear of her own, desperation thick in every word. But 1313 finished her words for her, speaking before he even realized that the words were escaping him. "No death at all," he whispered, shocks of ice rolling through him, images of his limited past flashing through his conditioned mind. Emiliana said no more. and he still did not have the strength in him to turn and regard her, so he knew not what expression she turned on him then. The Commissar turned an eye on them, noticing their chatter, but his attention was called away an instant later. "It's done, Commissar," said one of the tech adepts by the hanging bombs control panel. Seemingly in response to his word, panels opened up all along the enormous weapon, thick armor and plates rearing back to reveal vibrant green canisters, each one a vial of the Death Eater virus, the plague which would devour this world. But 1313 did not look up to see it, did not crane his head behind his body to gaze upon the death of them all. All he could do was stare into the back of Captain Stern's head, and the Imperial Aquila that was tattooed there. The eye of the twin-headed eagle gazed up into his own, one head blinded, one head whole. Why did he feel as though he saw judgment there, in that single avian eye? Why was that judgment so cold, so painful? Did he worship the Emperor? Or did he only worship death in the Emperor's name?
This is wrong,
Emiliana whispered, barely audible now, as Shadrach smiled and turned to face Captain Stern one last time. Was this wrong? Why was he asking that question? It was not his job to judge that. He was but a tool, a soldier. He had his orders, and good soldiers followed orders. That was what was demanded of him. He was safe, even if the orders were wrong. They were not his responsibility. They were not his sin. He was just doing his duty. The Emperor had to know that. Emiliana had to know that. "Captain Stern," the Commissar began to say as he angled his new, stolen weapon down to aim into the Cadian's head. "The men and women here will all die as martyrs to the Imperium's cause. They will enter the Emperor's final service with the highest honor a guardsman can achieve, having given their lives for victory. But not you. You who led them against me, who broke the chain of command to obey a false saint," Shadrach proclaimed, flicking a switch on the gun he held, plasma beginning to heat within the coils. These words also struck at 1313 himself, still standing behind Stern, taking a few steps back as Shadrach prepared to execute the man personally with a very powerful weapon. What the Commissar had just said was implicitly wrong. Lazarus was no false saint. In fact, it was because he was a saint that they could not obey him above Shadrach. Again, he reminded himself that it was not his place to judge his superiors, to decide when they were right and wrong. "You will not be martyred. You will be executed here and now by me. In the Emperor's name, I condemn you to his darkest judgment. May he purge your soul of the fear that led you to this weakness," pronounced Commissar Captain Shadrach, the archaic weapon in his hand beginning to keen deeply and glow. Emiliana drew in a hissing breath, and though he could not see it, 13 knew her hands were now trembling. So was he, almost trembling.
This is wrong, and you know it!
The corporal insisted, speaking more loudly now, directing the words of the Commissar instead of the Krieger. Shadrach's eyes slid over to her, and he scoffed openly. "Already the sins of your captain infect the rest of you Cadians. It is better that you should die now than be seen for the laxity you now display in your duty. I always knew it lurked beneath the surface. The Cadian Guard has long been overlauded, but if you were the match of Krieg or Carcosa when it came to virtue, then perhaps Cadia would not have fallen. Ha! The idea that the Imperium would see the loss of a world and the continuing survival of its regiment as some kind of strength or victory has always been laughable. If you had more steadfast resolve, more faith, more willingness to do what is right, then perhaps Cadia would not have ever fallen at all. And if it did, then justice demands you fall with it," the cruel Commissar condemned, smirking widely a moment later when the signal light atop the beacon he still wore over his shoulder began to glow and blink. And it was as this occurred that 1313 realized that Emiliana was right and Shadrick was wrong. That it did not require a deep judgment to realize it. This was no opinion. This was no chanced or measured thought. It was simply the truth. Commissar Captain Shadrick had lost his mind and was issuing orders and making proclamations which were fundamentally wrong. The sons of Krieg had broken their own world and killed nearly everything on its surface because Krieg had sinned. Cadia had shattered, and yet its soldiers fought on, unbroken despite the breaking of their own homeworld. Weakness and vileness was the legacy of Krieg, and the very blood from which they all sprang, himself included. Heroism and sacrifice was the truth of Cadia, a truth that had carried them all the way to a new galaxy, a truth he had seen with his own eyes. How could 1313 ever have thought differently? Good soldiers followed orders, but when various contradicting orders were given, and the cold pages of the Munitorum manual offered a path that led into what was explicitly wrong, explicitly untrue, then what was a good soldier to do? Did he fight to die, or did he fight to win? The decision hovered over him like a lethal blade, pending his choosing of a path. The path of righteous duty, or the path of potential victory? Gritting his teeth, emotion breaking the surface of his placid features, he made his decision. "You are mistaken," growled the young man as he lifted his aim up from Captain Stern's head. Shadrick was still smirking as the gun's barrel was raised and pointed into his own center of mass. The commissar's eyes began to change as the words were slowly absorbed, but the change scarcely had time to reach the rest of his face before the young soldier continued. "Commissar Captain Shadrick, your judgment is impaired. In accordance with Munitorum Regulation 3123, I am divesting you of command until such a time that your mentality can be assessed by someone of higher rank," the Krieger announced, making the man's face redden. "I am here on behalf of the Inquisition. That regulation does not..." Shadrick began to contest. "Present evidence for the claim," 1313 ordered, and Shadrick found himself almost salivating with rage. "What are you saying? You do not even have cause to believe that I am unsound. I am under no obligation to..." He began to yell, but once more, the Krieger cut him off. Krieg sinned. The 15-year-old soldier stated, his face melting back into placidity, all pieces now in their place. Shadrick growled and began to lift his own weapon away from Captain Stern. "You insubordinate cur!" The commissar howled. Cadia stands. 1313 finished, his voice flat, matter-of-fact, his eyes level, steady as steel. And his heart did not ache as he pulled the trigger and fired the searing stream of light from his silvered hot-shot las pistol. The discharge was lightning fast, finding the center of Commissar Shadrick's chest before he could even blink. There was a brief moment as the air and armor there were atomized by the close-range impact of the hyper-agitated light photons. And then, the void created by the blast was rapidly filled, collapsing the air and throwing the discharged commander off his feet, back slamming into the floor with a loud crack. The room was frozen then, every mind shocked by the sudden turn, though 1313 did not pause as he raised his pistol, bending his elbow to look around it and see the damage he had done. Smoke and soot rising from the now unmoving chest of Commissar Shadrick. Satisfied with the shot, the Krieger nodded once, very slightly, and then looked to the side, half expecting to be executed himself, but having in him no fear of death at all. He saw that nearly every soldier in the room, Krieger and Cadian alike, was staring directly at him. The exposed faces of the Cadians slack-jawed beneath their helmets. But his eye found Emiliana's face first, her las rifle lowering, a relieved smile now slowly growing over her face as her eyes began to glisten. And then she stiffened and raised her rifle, firing her own concentrated beam and immediately ending the life of the would-be pawn of Shadrick's insane design. 1313 flinched, the searing heat moving right past his head as the photonic ray of energy carved into the skull of Shadrick's tech adept, who, while momentarily stunned like the rest, had suddenly moved with desperate speed to activate the release sequence for the bomb. It was an act he left incomplete as his head came apart in a blaze of light, body thumping over his tech interrogators, blackened blood soon pooling over the instrumentation. And that was not the end of it, as Shadrick's remaining guards spun on their heels to return the lethality sent into their master, only to find the fleeting sight of a knife entering an eye on each soldier, Vetnex having acted in the same moment as Emiliana, slinging 2 of his 4 weapons into their faces, and ending their lives nearly as quickly as Emiliana had ended the life of the tech adept. The tension was high in the aftermath, the Kriegers in the room holding their weapons steady, ready to engage. But there was no one among the Death Corps present who ranked higher than a sergeant, leaving no single figure to determine the right and wrong of what had just happened. All of it having had the creed of the Astra Militara invoked, the final judgment coming from one of their own. Instead, now they all faced the same crux that 1313 had already crossed. The decision left entirely in their hands, and after a moment, those hands lifted the barrels of their weapons skyward. The commanding officer was dead. The new commanding officer was, by protocol, Sergeant Vetnex, since Captain Stern was technically still designated as unfit for duty. The Cadians were slower to imitate them, lasguns still aimed in towards the silent soldiers of the Death Corps, but that did not last long either. "Lower your weapons," Vet growled at them. "All of you, no more Imperials are killing each other today." Without hesitation, the Cadians complied, most still in shock even as they lowered their barrels to the ground. A few seconds later, as it sank in that no one was going to be killing them all or forcing a fight between them, a beleaguered cheer rose up from the men in green, first staggered and then unanimous. 1313 stared blankly as he was suddenly yanked forward into an embrace, Emiliana holding him tightly as she joined the chorus. Relief and elation mixing like a heady drug in every single soldier that still valued their life. The corpsmen had no reaction, standing right where they were and awaiting further orders, save for 1313, who felt an odd heat branding over his face as the Cadian woman pulled him in close. Captain Stern lifted himself back up to his feet, sweating profusely and grinning like an idiot, just as subject to the sudden relief as any of his men. He came over to 1313 and slapped his helmet as Emiliana blushed and gave him back a little space, though the slap was playful as opposed to chastising. "Emperor bless you, you crazy death-worshipping plank. I'll make sure you get promoted for this, soon as I get my captaincy back," the dark-skinned, amethyst-eyed Imperial announced, a renewed cheer following the proclamation. The celebration, however, was cruelly short-lived. Shadrick gasped, eyes suddenly fluttering into wakefulness, something only 1313 saw as it happened. His face tensed, and he tried to shove past the grateful captain, arm caught between them. Yet before he could fire off a second killing shot from his last pistol, the commissar lifted his stolen plasma gun and aimed it up, shaky grip centering on the Kriegsman who had shot him and the captain standing in front of him. "For the Imperium!" The wounded Shadrick growled, blood flecking his white teeth before he jerked his arm higher still and fired. The shot sailed over their heads, the cheers dying on the lips of any voicing them as countless eyes followed the arcing ball of plasma. It slammed into the massive chain which held the bomb aloft, and in a flash of blue radiance, it ate through the metal and snapped the binding cleanly. The virus bomb, already opened and primed for detonation, hung for only a brief moment before plummeting into the pit, hurtling towards the heart of the world it would soon kill. "You insane frack!" Vet roared, speaking as he raised his arm, knife brandished in his hand. He threw it end over end at the commissar on the ground, just as 1313 freed his arm and fired, both intent on ending Shadrach before the rest of them died from the bomb. But in a second flash of light, the commissar was suddenly gone. Vetnex's knife burrowing 2 inches into the stone ground where Shadrach's head had been. A searing hot beam of light blowing a head-sized hole in the ground beside it. And all the while, everyone watched on. 1313 did not fear death, but somehow, this felt worse than death. This felt like failure, and his strength, long upheld, began to flee him rapidly. He sagged on his feet, supported by Emiliana as a wave of raw humanity passed through him. His raised arm dropped to his side, his heart racing, mind slowing, but thoughts entirely blank. Nothing could be done. No line could be charged. No tactic could be used. He had failed. He had tried to do the right thing, and he had failed.
13. It's all right, 13.
The corporal said to him, her voice trembling as she felt him slackening more and more.
No, it isn't. I didn't stop him. Shadrach won. The Imperium lost,
he said, words hollow, his lowered remaining arm shaking, his gun dropping from his hand. But the Cadian woman did not drop him, shoving him back onto his feet and grasping either side of his head.
You did what you thought was right,
she said to him, eyes boring into his remaining one, an eye that now stung, now rimmed with rare tears.
You will still die,
he said in a whisper. She nodded her head, not denying it.
We all will. That isn't what matters now,
was her answer to him. 1313 closing his eye as she wiped it for him.
How can you say that? Even now, how are you like this?
He asked her, wondering how she still had this strength, even in the face of a death she had wanted to avoid, even when he felt his faltering in the face of his failure. She firmed her expression, hands sliding down to his shoulders and helping him steady himself.
Because I have always known what matters, and it still matters,
the corporal asserted.
Not that we live, not even that we win,
she continued, pulling her hands back and allowing him to support himself fully, giving him a grim, humorless, but genuine smile.
Only that we try, onto our dying breath. All that is asked of us is that we never break and never stop aiming for the victory, for what is right, that we hold fast, even in the face of despair, even in the face of death. All that the Emperor demands of us is that we die standing.
And with the words, 1313 suddenly understood. His eye widened, and he nodded, his face, numbness receding. This was the strength of Cadia, the reason they had never broken when Krieg had been broken so long ago. This was the strength of Yurten, the true power of humanity. How had he not noticed it before? How had he confused death-seeking for this? The difference between his home and her own now became apparent in his mind. The Death Corps embraced death, accepted it, surrendered to it. The Cadian Guard stood firm against it, even if it meant death. They never surrendered to it. To embrace the end and to defy the end. Neither staved off death, but both defined its context. He steadied his face and nodded firmly back to her. Die standing. Yes, I can still do that, he stated, his voice not trembling, not entirely placid, but composed of a newer strength, and Emiliana's smile grew softer. There was no joy in it, but there was pride, and he shared it with her, if only for a brief moment. What a strange feeling. Pride. Not shame, not fear, not faith, but pride. So this was what it felt like to be free. He was oddly glad and thanked the Emperor that he could experience it at least once, even if only now, at the very end.
"Well said,"
spoke a voice from the entrance into the room.
"Well said indeed."
All faces turned to see the willowy shape of Ishtara Ordain, her body wrapped in bandages, her hand gripping a small flamer. She stalked and strode into the room like a being submerged in water, just heavy enough to propel herself forward.
"Holiness,"
said Captain Stern, his face stricken.
"We failed to stop him. The bomb."
He began to explain.
"All is as it should be. The Emperor's design cannot be subdued by something as meager as a virus bomb,"
spoke the Canoness Superior.
"Even as we speak, the entirety of the Imperium's forces on this planet are sheltering here, in the house of their Emperor. They shall not be betrayed. This I swear,"
the old, bandaged woman announced, striding forward.
"Go, survive, carry the lessons learned here to the rest of the Imperium. Ensure that St. Lazarus does not fail,"
she continued to say as she walked up to and past the captain.
"But Canoness, the weapon was primed,"
shouted Sergeant Vetnex.
"It will detonate the moment it strikes the ground. There is nothing that can be done,"
he insisted. She scoffed at that and continued moving forward, acting as though the very voiced notion was ridiculous.
"Who decided that?"
she asked him without looking back in Vet's direction.
"A man with a weapon? An inquisitor hiding in the shadows? A prideful sinner with a single breath left in his body? Is that all it takes to defeat your faith? Deny me not. I speak for the Emperor. I am his will made manifest, and I am not so easily defeated. Go, I said. Think no more of this. Leave it in the Master's hands. He shall not lead you astray."
Ishtara countered, moving closer and closer to the raised rim of the altar. The venerable Canoness paused then, standing beside 1313 and Emiliana.
"The two of you,"
she announced, turning to face them, her eyes bright and golden, like the rays of the sun.
"Aid me. These old bones have one last journey to make,"
Ishtara ordered. At her command, the two soldiers hesitantly nodded and went to either side of her, taking her hands and helping her as the ancient Canoness endeavored to climb the tall base of the altar, stepping onto the heads of stone daemons and climbing upon the angled blades of the angels who struck down at them. As she did, she leaned heavily against 1313 in spite of his one arm, and her lips came close to his ear.
Keep that pride, man of Krieg. Stand taller than the sin that plagues you.
She said in a voice that was not her own, and when she pushed away from him and stood atop the rim of the pit, the Krieger was left breathless, his final eye wide as a plate as he tried to absorb her words.
"I go now to do the Emperor's will. Ensure that you do the same,"
the venerable priestess of war proclaimed to the assembled soldiers. And then, without further preamble, she leaned forward and fell into the yawning pit, descending like a thin lance wrapped in flagging bandages, aimed right for the soon-to-be rotting heart of Axum. Coleman ordered his command gunship to circle the entire perimeter of the basilica several times, alien eye stalks taking in all he saw. The Imperial forces were abandoning their ruined walls and fortifications, retreating in layered withdrawals back into the massive central construct that was the Gothic cathedral at the center. His hundreds of gunships circled with him, most heavy with troops and vehicles, all unloading with strafing distance fire from their various laser cannons and missile launchers, encouraging the retreat and blasting the lines of imps as they fell back. purple enemy gunships had been present, descending and disgorging additional forces from the enormous duo of Imperial starships which hung perilously above the battlefield, directly skyward of the Imperial Church Fortress. The alien Jedi Master clicked his tongue within his upside-down, lipless mouth, one of his eye stalks staring up at the gargantuan dreadnoughts as they exchanged fire with several encroaching Venators from all sides. Before they had been locked up with the Republic's space forces, Kekaj had noticed that they had fired various rounds of some kind of low-impact weapon into the spires around their combat zone. All tall, but distant from the actual battlefield. The Jedi Council member was no stranger to odd deployment tactics and suspected that these were not weapons at all, but some method of quick disembarkment, and the scattered pattern of it all suggested some kind of encirclement. This was emphasized as the likely case within his alien mind as dropships followed the trails of those first salvos, even as the Venator reinforcements began to converge and fire into the imposing Imperial ships. Formidable though the invaders were, they were not invulnerable, and holding their positions in the air would mean they could only linger for a limited time, before they were brought burning to the steel earth of Axum's already scarred surface. Whatever these new foes were about to try, it was clear to the Jedi Master that it was going to be a rapid endeavor, and so he was silently compelled to act rapidly as well. Rapidly, but not hastily. 500 Jedi Knights and over 10,000 clone troopers were at his command, a force which could conquer a planet, brought together to force the Imperials out of their holes. Kekaj was determined not to squander them.
Commander Mayo,
He said as he eyed both Earth and air simultaneously.
how many dropships have landed in the immediate battlefield we are about to engage in?
The commander strode to the side of his Jedi general and saluted.
No less than 3, maybe 5 total if they got some down before we were able to observe them. Many more to the surrounding spires, though.
The clone reported. The Jedi Master nodded slowly, eyes blinking with sideways lids.
Contact Master Opor and Cesis. Request that he take another large contingent of Jedi and clones and secure those positions. I do not want to suddenly find our forces surrounded. I would like the spires cleared and secured, and if not that, contained so that none of the forces on the spires are free to advance.
The council member ordered.
Yes, sir.
Was the clone's swift reply before he turned away and began to relay the request. While he did, Coleman Kekaj turned his mind back towards the field of battle he would soon be invading. The civilian rebel casualties from this battle had been appalling. The charge towards the Basilica's defenses having left long, solid lines of corpses and wounded that he could easily see even now. Why had Master Mace Windu encouraged this kind of assault when it so obviously resulted in this atrocious rate of attrition? Admittedly, the late arrival of the Republic forces during the charge and his quick decision to withdraw from the perimeter of the combat zone had spared the Jedi many losses, both in the lives of their own order and that of the clones, but it also called into question the point of the attack at all. It was a question he and the others would be sure to ask later, but the past was immutable and the future needed to be shaped in the present. He doubted that the scant reinforcements which had landed would make a large difference, and their gunships, exposed on the ground, had remained only long enough to disgorge their warrior payloads, before rocketing away back up to their behemoth motherships, spitting light fire back at the Republic gunships as they retreated, neither side having had the chance to fully engage the other before they were gone. Coleman had barely managed to catch a glimpse of the last few reinforcements they dispatched, the large, purple and white armored warriors falling back into the cathedral almost as soon as they had disembarked. Space Marines, Coleman suspected. The most lethal possible warriors that the Imperial invaders could field, according to young Anakin Skywalker, who had nearly faced grievous injury or death at the hands of one of their own. But a literal handful of these kinds of soldiers could not stand against more than 50 times their number in Jedi. to say nothing of the clones who stood alongside them. Even so, K-Kaj was not quick to dismiss the threat, though in his mind, the encirclement and possible traps left behind by the Imperial retreat was where the greatest danger lay.
It is done, sir.
Reported Commander Neo.
Good. Have our armored forces begin landing outside of a perimeter. Have recon teams deploy along the upper and middle sections of the Imperial defensive front. Once free, they should quickly sweep the ruins and abandon the hardpoints for traps and unusual technology. Have them report anything they find, detonate anything suspicious with demolition teams. As they clear the area, have the Warhammer and speeder tanks advance with infantry to board.
The Master commanded, pointing down at the ground at landing zones as he did.
Once we have cleared and secured the outer and center portions of the approach, I want our forces to completely encircle the area around the cathedral. Have the AT-3Es take up their furthest positions to supply the front with focused fire, and create avenues for our TX-130s to move and respond freely to active threats. Order the turbo tanks following behind our gunships to move in behind everything else once they arrive. We will need them to provide defense from exterior attack. And under overlapping fire report for our forces once they re-engage the Empire.
He continued.
Aye, sir. And the Jedi?
Neo asked after a brief pause.
My order shall remain airborne, and will move in our strike forces to address anything unexpected or dangerous that may crop up. Once we have the entire exterior of the cathedral under our control, we shall deploy and force for the actual storming of their fortress. This way, we will never be too far from where we are needed, and will lead the charge past their final defensive structures.
K-Kaj explained to the commander, who nodded and snapped a quick salute before turning to relay the orders. Even with his plan now being acted out, the Angry Jedi Master was wary and reminded himself to remain flexible. There was no telling how the Imperials might react or what plans they themselves may already have in the works. He sensed great danger approaching, but for some reason he did not feel that danger was coming from the Basilica alone, nor the surrounding towers where the Space Marines had potentially deployed themselves. He turned his eyes away from where the fight would be occurring and faced them towards the horizon. Distantly, very distantly, his alien eyes could see another storm beginning to form there, punctuated by streaks of red lightning which menaced him even from so many miles away.
How long before that storm reaches us, Commander Meal?
He asked suddenly. The clone, who was busy communicating the attack plan, looked up and then stared in the same direction as the Jedi Master, withdrawing a pair of electro-binoculars to look through a moment later. He shrugged.
Maybe 45 minutes to an hour from now. Storms are common here on Axum, sir. According to the troopers we are relieving, they've already had plenty of rain today alone.
He informed the Jedi General. Coleman nodded warily, eyes still on that encroaching, twisting sneer of black clouds and distant thunder.
Yes, perhaps. Let us continue the talks, Commander. I want to be invading that final fortification well before we are rained on.
He said. Neo nodded sharply.
Right away, sir. We'll get this place secured on the double.
Saint Lazarus grit his teeth, pain shooting up through his various injuries as he was carried atop several shoulders and hands. His armored body ferried in an ocean of desperate humanity as he was moved within one of the adjoining chapels within the massive basilica. He had initially been brought into the temple by the strength and support of the canoness alone. Yet it had not taken long once crossing into the building for his state to be noticed by many others. They took it upon themselves to lift him high, moving him through the growing press. The basilica, empty moments before, was now rapidly filling with a chaotic mob of wounded soldiers and survivors from all branches of the Imperium, all who remained free on this cursed planet. But large though the building was, it was never intended to house so many as now sought to enter, and that was becoming obvious to see. Medical beds were laid out into hallways. Soldiers scrambled and pushed through the crowds, running to engage some kind of struggle or fight happening deeper within the basilica. And the pristine white floors of the Emperor's home were soon tarnished and dirtied by blood, ash, and whatever else the myriad forces of mankind dragged onto them. Tech priests and sisters of the noble orders of the Hospitaller moved through and between the many others, often suspended above the hordes of the Imperial survivors on hovering harnesses or spider-like mechadendrites, using the devices to stalk above the pressed masses of people and beds. Those who had no such augmentations stepped on the posts and sides of medical beds or climbed around shrines and ornate pillars, their sometimes bare and sometimes booted feet lithely balancing along as their hands and arms held assortments of data slates or clusters of medical necessities. Some space was eventually made for Lazarus, given his status, but he hardly believed he deserved it after the failure he had just suffered at the walls. It simply did not matter how many they killed or tried to force back, the Republic was becoming more numerous by the second, and their weapons of war, from tanks to airships, grew more varied by the minute. The faithful of the machine god and the Emperor alike were trapped, clustered around each other like a swarm of drowning rats, taking up the last aired space on their rapidly sinking ship. And worse yet, the new saint had no idea how to even begin to save them. So many reached for him, so many prayed for him, so many now depended on him, and the final words of Ishtara Ordain hung heavily in his mind. He had a duty to these people, not to win the battle, but merely to survive it. But what could be done now? There was very nearly no way out, and what ways there were, well, he could not see them, though he held to the faith that they did exist. The Emperor would not abandon them. The master of mankind would not have returned Lazarus from death only to fail. Would he? The heretical thoughts made him resent his position all the more. He was no major, no saint. Saints did not have doubts. Their faith was absolute. He could not help but feel an imposter throughout all of this, and yet he dared not show it. He owed the men and women around him too much for that. Before space had been created, Lazarus had spent this time doing what he could to ease those who came close, blessing the faithful who pleaded for it, taking ash and sweat from his own face and brow, and rubbing it into vaguely avian forms on the foreheads of the various humans who looked up towards him with eyes begging salvation. He voiced paltry blessings to each, and, impotent as they were, the words were drowned out more often than not by the heavy cacophony all around him. Orders, panic, prayers, all wrung from the high walls and vaulted ceilings of this holy place, echoing in spaces which had previously been meant for choir music and sermons. However, after a time, Leandra thundered at those around him, demanding space be made, and, even divested of her powered armor, her lungs clearly did not lack for the strength, and, by the force of her voice alone, the press around them was made to obey. Soon, after they were through the chapel, the unspoken question of where they were taking him was answered without words needing to be spoken. His body was carried up and up, through stairway passages, into an area of the Basilica of Salvation which had not yet been filled, or at least not completely. There was much more space here, and he could see the reason why right away. Medals, pauldrons of elaborate design, fine augmentations and gold-plated lasguns, humming plasma weapons, and sparking power swords and fists. All around him, the saint saw commanders, captains, and a few wounded mages who had joined with the retreating forces on their way to the basilica or who had been in some position around the besieged temple. The thought that other men, so much more like himself, were being forced into the press downstairs made the teeth he had left in his mouth grit together painfully. But he understood the necessity of it. How could they plan their way out of this while trapped in the cacophonous press that was to be found downstairs? None of the command staff here were silent, all speaking amongst each other, and half of them even properly discussing solutions in place of bemoaning their pessimistic outcome. He was not stopped here, however, taken further and further until he was laid onto a medical bed within the private shrine of the Canoness Superior herself. The sacred space was oddly austere, the room being barren, save for a few prayer mats, some select icons of the faith which hung from the walls, and a single banner of the Sisterhood which hung above the winged doorway. In the center of it all, a white marble carving of the Emperor himself stood tall, one which seemed half completed, the vagueness of their god emerging from the white stone like the semblance of a man bursting from an ocean of pale white milk. The saint was not alone within, even after those who had helped carry him in were curtly dismissed by the Canoness commander, who had been serving as his bodyguard throughout the battle. Leandra stood away from him after the others had departed, kneeling before the statue of the Emperor, her hands clasped together, head lowered in prayer and supplication as another 3 sisters entered the room and approached his bed, crowding around Lazarus. Their hands reached for him, peeling away his armor and then sackcloth robes to expose his many new but minor injuries. They paid his modesty little heed, chanting prayers all the while, even as he raised meager and ignored protests. Distracting himself from their ministrations, the saint looked around. Only the lit wall scones provided any substantial light, but it was enough to see by. Already waiting within was a tall woman who he assumed to be Commissar Jane Leros, the one who had saved all of their lives with her timely intervention, and whose sudden arrival had turned the Republic back, even if only temporarily. She had divested herself of her power fist and other weapons, save for a bolt pistol which hung at her waist, the other items dangling from a steel hook on the wall near where she was leaning. She was holding what appeared to be a skull in her hands, the severed head cleanly flensed and lightly luminous in the twilight of the chamber. Lazarus very nearly missed the other figure standing behind the statue of the Emperor, looming at the intersection of several shadows. There stood a leering, red-eyed soldier whose face was encased in a full ceramite mask. A Tempestus Scion, Lazarus realized, before amending his observation. No, not just a mere soldier of that elite corps, but none other than a Tempestor Prime, or at least that was what his regalia and uniform seemed to indicate. The Thunderbird emblem he wore on his dark armor, and the muted colors of dark red, deep blue, and dull gray which formed the checkerboard pattern on his shoulder cape marked him out as a Calambian, and the very same man who had saved Lazarus' life at the Battle of the Bloody Bridges, the Prime known as Aloysius Cinder. Then he spotted the other hospital bed, in the corner of the room in place of a cross from his own. A preternatural darkness seemed to linger there, at least until Lazarus noticed that there were obstructions on the wall scones, black knives embedded into their sides at odd angles, creating strips of shadow which all converged on that corner, hiding its 2 inhabitants in flickering, wavering darkness. A small woman and an enormous man were there, the man sitting on the bed, his back leaned against the wall. It was not clear if the man was alive, for he seemed unmoving, and he was clearly badly wounded, dried and clotted blood leading the way to the bed from across the otherwise clean floor. The man was wearing a dark trench coat which spilled over the sides of the medical bed, the woman wearing something similar but much smaller. She was helping to brace the larger man against the wall, herself perched to his side, one hand pressed against his chest to keep him steady, while the other held a wicked curved blade of the same kind as those embedded into the sides of the scones. She leered around, a guardian's air about her, as she held the weapon out threateningly, as if warding away any who might see, forcing them to keep their distance. The woman was of blonde hair and pale complexion, and her eyes seemed to glow a malevolent red as they swept back and forth across the room. These 2 Lazarus did not know at all, but he could remember them from the battle, fighting against the Jedi. He had not witnessed the full conclusion of that battle, but judging from the slumped and still form of the black-haired man, it had not gone well. Whoever they were, being allowed into this room meant something for certain, even if he did not yet know what. Lazarus bided his time, as he could not speak or address any of them with any dignity, while the sisters Hospitaller who surrounded him did their work, rebandaging his wounds, stitching him shut where he was bleeding, jamming tools into his mouth to yank his broken teeth and replace them with quick, augmentative replacements, and painfully removing the remains of his mechanical arm and leg, leaving him lopsided and out of balance. They worked quickly, however, and in only a handful of minutes they were wrapping his body back within his sackcloth raiment, daubing his bruised skin with sacred oils, and whispering blessings over him. Once their work was completed, they stood up and began backing away while bowing and facing him, bending multiple times every couple of steps until they were outside the doors, which closed. Lazarus was not sure he would ever grow accustomed to that kind of reverence, groaning as he pushed himself upright with his remaining living arm and sat, crippled but alive, in the medical bed. He was surprised that they had made no attempt to heal the other man against the wall, perhaps realizing that he was already dead, or perhaps not wanting to come anywhere near his red-eyed guardian. He did not have much time to contemplate it, however, since the moment the Hospitaller departed, 3 of the others in the room approached him. Leandra rose from her prayer, forming the sign of the aquila over her breast, as Jane pushed off from the wall and straightened her hat and burnt overcoat. All the while, Cinder turned to fully face Lazarus and sauntered out from beneath the shadows, stepping like a cat in the commissar's own wake. The saint gave them a wan smile, feeling his guts clench as he realized that, once more, he was playing center to a group of figures who far outstripped him. How, by the Emperor's golden teeth, had he ended up in this situation?
Saint Lazarus?
Spoke the commissar, her voice clipped, but not unpleasant.
I do not believe we have formally been introduced. I am Commissar Colonel James Lee Ross, at your eternal service.
She greeted with a stiff salute. Lazarus raised an eyebrow at those words. He had not expected that to be her claimed title, not by a long shot. Commissar Colonel? Isn't that kind of function a little unorthodox? He pried, trying not to show the difficulty he was having in finding his sitting balance with only one arm and one leg. She smirked subtly at him and gave a brief nod.
It can appear that way, Holiness. But, like you, I only achieved my current rank after this battle had already commenced. I have been given this promotion in recognition of my efforts and successes concerning the preservation of our main forces at the slaughter of the spires.
She reported, hands behind her back and legs spread, her back straight as a rod. Still, I can't remember the last time that rank was earned by anyone at all. Tales of Commissar Gaunt and his ghost aside, I had thought its existence was no more than a soldier's rumor, not an actual option for command. The saint said, softly questioning the legitimacy of her claim.
And yet, it is my rank,
she asserted. Lazarus shrugged his shoulders and sighed, suppressing a wince as an agonized sting wrung its way through his injured, missing arm. Seems like I'll see every strange exception play out before I'm sent back to the Emperor's side, Lazarus suggested, indicating for her to relax with his remaining arm and almost falling over for the effort. She did so, but relaxed her stance only slightly.
Well, with all due respect, Your Holiness, the promotion was handed down to me directly by Marshal Dovin approximately 8 minutes before the fall of Central Command. So, I'd say that my elevation is less of an exception than your own rise to the rank of Major.
She offered, face stern, but tone hinting at the jibe being no more than that. Lazarus felt a twitch ring across his face. This Commissar Leros had an effective way of showing how much she already knew, without leading the conversation fully into it. The recently anointed saint nodded his head and resolved to change the subject, not intending to mince words with a political officer. Fair enough, Commissar Colonel. I did receive reports about the Battle of the Azure Spires, but what I was given was sparse and sometimes contradictory, he began to say.
Slaughter, Holiness. It was a slaughter.
She corrected without hesitation, strong face hardening as she spoke. How so? What happened? He asked without missing a beat.
It's hard to work out the details. However, what is clear is that the Jedi preempted our route. They knew we would come to the aid of the Basilica, and they placed themselves in and among the surrounding spires around the primary road of Silver Central Avenue, was created the route we were using to travel.
Lyros began to report. Ah, they ambushed you there? Lazarus asked, but she shook her head.
Not as such, Holiness. They did not confront us directly until after the slaughter was completed.
The commissar corrected again. Then how? Lazarus began to ask.
It was the spires themselves. The witches found a way to drop and direct their descents. They dropped the city on us, Holiness. By the time we understood the nature of the attack, the spires were already falling on us, and we were trapped by the organization of our own columns. We lost a lot of tanks and a lot of good people before we even saw a single Jedi.
Jane Lyros explained. Lazarus was taken aback by that. He had been under the impression that he and his had gotten the worst of the fighting. It looked like he had several assumptions to correct on that matter. I see. How on Terra did you make it out of there with so many people? He asked, but again, she shook her head.
Not so many, Holiness. Figures are hard to collect right now, but I reckon only about 30% of our main force managed to escape the spire attack. The Jedi plot was largely a resounding success. And then they fell on us directly. Only Jedi, no toy soldiers. Their force was comprised of thousands of psychers, all armed with power swords, all trained for what they proceeded to do to us.
The saint breathed in deeply, knowing that a similar fate was gathering outside of the Basilica, priming itself to fall upon them just as ravenously. A whole army of thousands of psychers, and this time, they would not be alone. How was the Imperium supposed to stand against that kind of enemy? So how did you escape? Did the Jedi let you flee? He asked, and she scoffed lightly in response.
We would all be dead, or the prisoners of the Jedi, had they been fully successful. No, Holiness. They showed us no mercy. Many acknowledged my coordination and quick actions afterward as factors in our survival, but the truth of the matter is that we were saved by the same man who stopped the spires from falling on all of us, who spent himself and his life saving everyone he could before it was too late.
Jane admitted, letting the words hang in the air before lifting the skull and making every eye squint as she did. The luminous skull was not so bright as she held it clutched in her hand, yet looking directly at it prompted the same response from everyone, each Imperial feeling a sudden pressure meeting their minds. To Lazarus, it felt like wind being blown right into his face, right up against his eyes, though there was no billowing movement, no sign of force or physical presence. The skull itself was odder than he had thought upon first spotting her holding it. In the center of its forehead was a patch of bone which seemed to have been smoothed and calcified into the semblance of a quartz crystal, and from it streaked veins of the same material, creating a languid, wavy starburst of clear gemstone which spread its tendrils across the breadth of the bone it had grown into.
What is that?
Canoness Leandra growled, her hand falling to the pommel of her sword, which she still wore around her waist in a tertiary holster she had gotten for herself. The commissar turned to look at her at the words, apprehension tightening her expression somewhat.
This is Saint Gaxian Krell, Holy Sister. He was a Chimera Psyker under the command of Commissar Terrandor. It was he who sacrificed his life holding of the spires. My squad and I tried to save him, but by the time we had him in our custody, it was already dissolving. What I hold here is all that remains of Krell. But, as you can feel, what remains is much more than just his skull.
Jane Lyros explained as she held the item up before Lazarus.
He was a witch.
Leandra snarled.
And this feels like heresy. He was not anointed. You have no right to call him a saint.
The canoness added angrily, and Jane's face scrunched in response, but her discipline did not break.
With respect to the Holy Sister, he died speaking the Emperor's words. He saved us all multiple times. First, by standing against an army of true witches and apostates, holding back their schemes and victory, and then countless more times in the battle that followed.
The commissar explained. Elaborate, ordered Lazarus, and she nodded.
What you are feeling now, the Jedi can feel it as well. but several hundreds of times more powerfully.
She added, now lowering the skull and resuming her rigid posture.
I can fully and personally attest to seeing this man kill at least 22 Jedi, even after his death. Without his Aegis, who would never have made it back to Central Command, who would not have been able to drive the Jedi away, I would never have been promoted, and we would never have been able to reach you and drive the Republic back.
The Commissar stated sharply. Leandra gave a sour expression and seemed to be about to protest the words further, but Jane continued to speak.
If Gaxian Crow is a heretic, then heresy has saved this basilica and all the faithful within it. I do not believe that to be the case, so I cannot agree that Gaxian Crow is a heretic. He went above his duty, and because of it, we can all stand here and debate his sainthood at all. If not for him, we would be kneeling on the ground in the face of Republic blasters, or being thrown as corpses from the sides of the city.
She concluded. Leandra did not look pleased, barely placated in fact, but she did not object or speak quickly enough to stop Lazarus from speaking first. Well said, Commissar. I'll not turn away any ally right now. Not when we are being ground beneath the Republic's pale heel. Not when we need all the help we can get. He said, but the severe look Leandra threw his way had him suddenly sweating. The last thing he needed was an internal conflict, and so he thought quickly. However, he added a moment later, perhaps it is best if we turn Gaxian's remains over to the Sisterhood for now. Maybe he is merely a great hero of the Imperium. Or maybe I am not the only saint to be found on this planet. Whatever the case may be, I believe the brides of the Emperor are the most qualified to determine what is the Emperor's will. Are we agreed? He offered to the two women, who even then seemed to glare at one another, Leandra's scowl being the most open of the two. Neither seemed entirely pleased by his words, but they also seemed less likely now to suddenly begin fighting amongst themselves, and with a stiff nod, Jane Leros held out the skull to the sister, who hesitantly reached out and took it. After a brief moment's consideration, the canoness left the room with the head of Gaxian Krell in hand, saying nothing more about her intentions as she left. Jane seemed stressed by the entire series of actions, but Lazarus waved at her to calm down. Have faith, Commissar Colonel. All will be well, he assured her, and after a breath's span of stillness, she seemed to relent with a slightly less stiff nod of her chin.
Of course, Holiness,
she affirmed. Good, good. Well, now that we are acquainted, let me offer a word of thanks before we move on to the planning of this defense, said Lazarus, reaching down with his remaining arm to grip the side of the bed to keep himself steady. I thank you, Commissar Colonel Jane Leros. Without your intervention, I doubt I or the canoness would still be in any position to debate anything. And I extend the same thanks to you, Tempestor Prime Cinder. You saved my life at the Battle of the Bloody Bridges. I did not get the opportunity to thank you before, so let me do so now. Without you, I'd be less than a smear 100 miles below the Basilica. Lazarus offered to them, gesturing towards the, till now, silent leader of the Calambian Thunderbirds. The tall man nodded once, almost robotically. Doing my duty, nothing more, were his succinct words, and after another pause to see if he would add any more, Lazarus nodded somewhat awkwardly and coughed. All right. Well, if anyone has any ideas as to how we can stave off the Republic's next assault, I'm all ears, he said sheepishly. We do not, said a rasp from the darkest corner of the room. The others turned to regard the deep, raspy voice, and, to Lazarus's deep surprise, it was coming from the man he thought dead.
Sam, don't!
The woman at his side began to say, but he shook his head at her before she could finish, straightening a little, but not rising.
Duty calls, Heck. Not my place to be silent when decisions are being made,
he said.
And who are you? How did you even manage to be allowed in here?
Asked Commissar Leros, and in response the man gave her a tombstone smile.
My name is Samuel Weiler, Inquisitor of the Zektek Triumvirate.
the large man claimed, reaching into his coat and shakily withdrawing something on a chain. An inquisitorial rosette. Aloysius Cinder went down to one knee right away, his helmet authenticating the validity of the rosette in seconds, and Commissar Leros snapped a new salute his way, her posture stiffening. Lazarus could not but marvel, wondering what he should do in his state. But before he could make any gesture, the man waved their postures away with his free hand.
Rise. Relax. We stand on the cusp of defeat, so there's little time for the pleasantries of ceremony,
he said, forcing the words out through a paling face, clearly not holding up from his injuries very well.
I'll break it down easy for everyone. The Basilica is lost. The planet is lost. We need to organize some way to evacuate. I doubt more and more that the self-proclaimed War Master ever intended to hold this place properly when he set forces down here. Thought at first that perhaps he was playing some grander strategy. And maybe he is. But if so, it involves the sacrifice of our position here, and potentially all of our personnel, to whatever that cause is.
The Inquisitor began to explain. Lazarus felt a fire and tightness spike through his chest and guts. He grit his teeth tightly, barely holding himself back from an outburst as the words sank in. "That's unacceptable," he said into the pause. "Lord Makarion can't just toss us away like that. It's... Lazarus began to sputter.
It's borderline heretical,
The Inquisitor said, nodding his head.
Trust me, Satan, Lazarus. I know. I have no intention of dying here, and letting everyone here die with me. Besides, whatever he wishes to achieve, it clearly involves replacing a good amount of our own loyalist special forces. The intentional loss of Kriegers, Calambians, and Cadians, to say nothing of the rest stationed on this planet.
The huge man explained, shaking his head with a trembling sigh.
The only purpose I can deduce for that madness being committed intentionally is to clear the upper echelons to make room for something else. Likely to make room for forces that are more loyal to him than to other principles of the Imperium.
He finished. Lazarus could barely countenance what the Inquisitor was proposing. Lord Tyrannus Makarion II, the Lord General that Davik Thune had chosen to lead the Guard, who had followed them into the galaxy, was a highly respected tactical genius. How could he choose to do all of this? To abandon his own forces on a doomed posting just to clear the board? That is outrageous, Inquisitor. If this is true, if he really chose to do this, then I'll... Lazarus began to growl, but a raised hand from the large wounded man halted the Imperial Saint.
You will do your duty and no more,
ordered the voice of the Emperor, eyes intense despite the agony clearly reflected there.
You will leave the rest to the Inquisition. If there is justice to be had, it shall be rendered by us, not by you, not by the Ecclesiarchy. Am I understood, Saint Lazarus?
The Inquisitor asserted, forcing a resigned nod from Lazarus, who reminded himself to clamp down on his opinion. This man was no ecclesiarch or Lord General. He was a full-blown Inquisitor, and clearly the various elevations that Lazarus had been subject to in the last 24 hours meant next to nothing to the likes of him. The large man's face relaxed visibly, or at least as much as he could manage to relax it, given the massive wound in his chest.
Good. Good. If we all understand each other, that brings me to the good news. Any second now.
Samael began to explain, blood flecking his lips as he did. In that moment, the doors opened once more, but it was not Sister Leandra alone who re-entered. Behind her, Two enormous forms, not large enough to be ogrins, but far too large to be mere men, stepped inside the austere chamber. The whir of mechanical servos and the smell of holy anointing oils followed them inside, eye lenses glowing, enormous bodies striding forward with a surety that proclaimed victory. Lazarus felt his eyes widen, and he suddenly wondered what he should do, even more so now than with the Inquisitor. Sure, he was now some kind of saint, but did not even saints bow before angels? They spoke before he could decide.
You do not need to concern yourself with the defense of this place any longer. We are evacuating you and every other citizen of the Imperium from this basilica,
said the transhuman warrior to her right, a tall and ornate space marine lord. The Inquisitor sighed and laid back, and the other marine opposite the one who had spoken turned his head towards Samael right away. The armor of the first marine was like a walking shrine, amethyst in color, but caked in silver and gold finery. His rank, his accomplishments, and those of his chapter were written thickly over every inch of his ceramite-encased body. Lazarus felt his breath nearly being sucked out of his lungs as a realization struck him. This angel of death was a captain. And not just any Astartes captain. He was clearly the first captain of the chapter. His pedigree proclaimed by the sigils on his pauldron. He was a leader and lord of the first company of his brothers, necessarily a living legend of war, a master of death, even among the Emperor's own angels. The saint saw that the other two had made to kneel, both the Commissar and the Tempestor Prime lowering themselves to the floor as the massive men entered, and Lazarus haphazardly went to do the same, kept from falling over by the supportive hand of Leandra as she came to stand beside him and steady his posture. But she did not kneel, and did not permit him to either, merely bowing her head in acknowledgement as she held the saint in place.
We are honored to receive you, and the Emperor's aid now in our darkest hour,
she said, speaking for both of them. Lazarus could not but nod and keep a brave face as the other, the warrior who was not a captain, moved past the first. He was dressed in white-powered armor and strode forward to loom over the Inquisitor, examining the slumped man with red lenses and reaching out. The woman beside him tensed, but a thick fist wrapped around her forearm and stopped her from moving.
Relax, Heck. I need them to get me fixed up,
the Inquisitor assured as he held her back.
You are Samael Weiler,
the white-clad Marine said, not truly asking, though the wounded man nodded his head weakly.
You are badly injured. You will need a heart transplant. What is your chapter of origin?
The apothecary asked as he gently punched forward with his extensive medical gauntlet, pointed probes entering the Inquisitor's chest and feeding information directly back into the brain of the Marine.
No. Get me an augmentative replacement, Skywatch variant. Transplants won't.
Samael Weiler began to explain.
Understood. The flesh is weak. I shall have a replacement of steel ready in a number of minutes. What else do you need?
The Marine said, cutting him off.
Right. Clots in my chest. Organs are not doing well. Sifting a lot of burnt blood. 2 ribs are severed near my spine. Need to brace them.
The Inquisitor continued to report, the Marine tending to him, nodding and priming several chemical treatments. Meanwhile, the first Marine approached Lazarus, his shadow falling over the Imperial Saint, eye lenses bright in the dim light.
I have been informed that you are Saint Lazarus. Is that correct?
The super soldier rumbled from on high. The former sergeant could barely find his voice to answer with. He had seen Space Marines before, during the evacuations of Zektek, but this man, and even the apothecary, were taller than what he was used to seeing, standing almost a foot or more higher than the Marines of the Skywatch had. Yes, I am he. The Saint managed to get past his throat, to which the transhuman nodded.
Your new augmentations will arrive soon and be connected. Once they are, you will come with me. By the time you are ready, the first of the evacuation ships will be launching back to our fortress monastery, which is holding position in orbit as we speak. The rest of the command staff shall follow shortly after.
The Space Marine of the Tempered Hands dictated. His voice was thunder, his gaze a raw pressure, his every movement an elegant impossibility. And yet, Lazarus found the strength to shake his head in denial of the Astartes' edict. "I cannot go," he said, almost coughing the words out, which prompted a curious tilt from the Space Marine's head.
Why not?
Was the simple question he received in return. Lazarus shook his head again and took a deep breath, steadying himself and firming his resolve. "The Republic is about to launch another assault. They are closing in around the Basilica even now, and I won't fail in the mission given to me," the Imperial Saint clarified.
And what mission is that?
Asked the captain. "To save as many as I can," was Lazarus' stalwart response, filling the words with all the conviction he had left in his body. "I won't flee while my men still fight. The Emperor did not give me back my life so that I could hold it above those of my soldiers. In the words of the Canoness, I was given back not my life, but my death. And I would be failing that if I did not risk that death doing as she commanded me, as the Emperor commanded me," he explained forcefully. The Marine leaned back and seemed to consider the words. Lazarus felt like he might be crushed under his scrutinizing gaze, but after a moment or so, the enormous man nodded his helmed head, neither judging nor lauding the words.
Then who shall go first?
The Marine asked.
You are in command of the Basilica, yes?
The Astartes continued, and after a pause, Lazarus formed an answer, even as he began sweating beyond the demands of the room's temperature. I am. And it is my will that the wounded be taken first, beginning with the most critically injured. Command staff or not, everyone else will be needed to fight off the next assault, Lazarus found himself saying. The Marine made an odd, mechanical grating sound that suddenly had Lazarus feeling a flush in his face. The transhuman warrior was laughing, or at least chuckling at him. "Do you find my cause amusing? Do you think the wounded any less worthy of rescue?" The Saint snapped, single fist clenching, but the Astartes shook his head.
We will do as you say. The wounded shall go first,
affirmed the super soldier.
But none of your men will be required to drive off the Republic's next assault,
said the first captain. Lazarus blinked at that. How quickly was this evacuation going to be? There was no way to corral them all into gunships and leave the surface of the planet before the Republic's next attack. Lazarus was sure of it. What do you mean? I realize the first company of any Space Marine chapter is formidable. I've heard the legends, and I've seen the work of squads of Marines, even if from afar. But you will take losses. Your numbers will be dwarfed by what the Republic is gathering outside even now. The former sergeant tried to explain, but the enormous warrior merely shook his head.
The first company has not arrived to help you,
said the captain of the first company, leaving Lazarus even more confused than before, until the super soldier clarified himself further.
The entire chapter has ridden to your aid, and the Arch-Imbalancer is addressing the defense of your Basilica personally. There will be no losses. No angels shall fall before we are finished. The only one of us whom they will even be able to target will be the master of our chapter, and he is already dead. And rest assured, Saint Lazarus, no matter how hard the Republic may try, they cannot kill death.
Hey there, fellow fans. Fan with too much time here, wishing you all a happy Mother's Day, and hoping you're enjoying this latest episode of Star Wars vs. Warhammer 40k, The Lords of Catastrophe. This series has been a lot of fun to make, though it has not been easy, and I can honestly tell you I would not have made it this far if not for the constant moral support given to me by my fellow fans, who quite literally help lift me up as I feel heavy under all the work that needs to get done to make sure that I reach the end and finish. However, I should inform you that I also do live another life as my own creator of my own original works and comic books in particular. And towards that end, I have been doing quite a lot recently in promoting the steps I need to take in order to finally become an independent creator in the way I've always dreamed that I could be. For you see, fellow fans, it is truly my greatest dream to one day stand as a truly independent content creator, producing novels, comic books, and all other kinds of creative media for people to consume, learn from, and escape into. But it's a scary time for creatives, with AI devices like ChatGPT essentially providing free, functional writing at zero overhead cost. It's begun making the landscape a little more hostile than I had imagined it would be. But as long as there are good fans out there who will not accept a lower quality product and mindless corporate efficiency over stories and narratives created by minds not so dissimilar to your own, then I have faith, true faith, that I can eventually reach this dream before Judgment Day rolls around. And that was what I wanted to talk to you about today. A few months ago, I introduced many of you to the first major creative work made between me and my brother. The world of the Red Hunt, with Red Hunt issue number 1. At that time, thanks in large part to your support here from this channel, me and my brother actually did manage to gather up enough funds to continue and begin production of Red Hunt issue number 2, further expanding upon the world of Red Rune, as well as everything around him, from the various mysteries that are invested within this alternate universe rendition of the United States, to all of the various monsters that inhabit it, and the monster hunters who must risk their lives to place some barrier between them and civilization itself. But today, I come to introduce you to a new world, one of high fantasy, of powerful sorcery, of combating cultures, and distinct magic. Please allow me to formally introduce you to the world of Song and Stone. This project is my pride and joy, and it is my hopes that with help from you, I'll be able to kick it off as not just a single issue, but an entire expansive narrative. To that end, I have made this, the first issue of Song and Stone, free to anyone who would like to view it on my website at thenightlibrary.net. You can find a link to it down below in the description of this video. It has been a distinct privilege to watch as this story that I've had for so long and I've been building up for such an amount of my life being converted into a format that you can enjoy. But just as with the Red Hunt, there is much more to this story that can be told in a single issue, and so I am eager to begin really producing and getting to work on issue number 2. And so I have launched a Kickstarter to help me fund and gather up the resources I will need to continue with this awesome work. If successful, if I can continue, then I will come one step closer to finally being able to support myself through my greatest passion, which is, of course, storytelling in various kinds of mediums. It's a dream that both me and my brother are constantly striving towards and constantly looking to achieve, something that we can only do with your help. Now, thanks to my comment section, I know that there are a fair amount of you who've been asking how you can give me back a little or reward me for all the work I've put into Star Wars versus Warhammer 40k and all the other free series I feature on my channel. If this is a genuine desire that you have, then I have a genuine way that you can help me that would be purely and completely amazing. Please look in the description down below, in the description of this very video, and check out the Kickstarter. If you like, please go ahead and read the comic. Judge its worth for yourself. If you see something that you think is worth investing in, please do. With that support, I have true faith and belief that one day me and my brother will accomplish our dream. We'll create various stories and multiple narratives, things that people can enjoy, can escape into, maybe even learn from. It is my pleasure to serve. But to serve, I need a little bit of help. So please, consider reading the comic. Consider looking at the Kickstarter. And if you think it's worth it, consider donating. It means the world to me. Thank you so much for giving me some of your time. And without further ado, I return you to the next episode of Star Wars vs. Warhammer 40k, The Lords of Catastrophe. Please enjoy. Jedi Master Oppo Rancisis narrowed his reptilian eyes, the wind blasting against his face and tossing his tangled beard as he hung outside of his command LAAT gunship. Alongside his own vessel were many, many others, various converging troop transports of airborne design which filled the air around them with the warbling buzz of repulsor lift engines. The designated spires where the enemy had touched down were just ahead, spikes on the skyline growing rapidly closer, and his keen senses were already tracking the nimble giants of the Imperium as they moved about atop them. Oppo had 4 arms and a serpentine body, his tail wrapped around 3 safety restraints within the gunship to enable him to protrude safely from the cabin, the wind whipping around his body and billowing his robes. His lower right hand rubbed subconsciously against the lightsaber wounds in his chest, the near-mortal injuries only recently healed that he had suffered through at the hands of the fallen Jedi Sora Bulk. His compatriots had assumed him dead, and he very nearly had died, though a potent force trance and subsequent back-to-tank treatments had saved his life. Phantoms of his brush with becoming one with the Force hovered close at hand as he shut his outer eyes and opened his inner ones. With a summoning of his training and discipline, the Jedi Master and Tactician initiated a state of comprehensive battle meditation and connected his mind with subtle skill to the minds of all of his clones. Not only that, but Master Rancisis stretched out his perceptions, casting them like nets over the locations occupied by those mysterious space marines. They appeared to be setting up equipment and deploying tanks, of all things. The spires were no meager distance from the Basilica, and the Jedi Master was left more than a little perplexed as to what it was they intended to do with them. Boxy, armored machines had been released onto every one of the handful of tower tops they now occupied, along with scores of supposed Imperial super soldiers. Were they creating a space to retreat into? Were these big metal boxes some kind of artillery, like the ATTEs, SPHAs, or the AV-7s? He did not know enough about them to be sure, and the emotions he read from the deployed Space Marines were muted at best, to the point where Rancisis began to wonder if they were not, in truth, droids. The Serpentine Jedi reached up with one of his hands and tapped against the communicator bead on the side of his head.
Captain Fordo, I do not trust this approach. Before we fall into their proper firing range, I want you to send out some LAT LEs to scout and assess their anti-air capabilities. Probe their defenses with a preemptive strafe,
he directed.
At your order, General,
was the veteran clone's communicated response. Oppo then watched on through the force and minds of the assigned clones and pilots as their nimble, city-oriented variant gunships sped ahead of the rest of their airborne force. He was pleased to see that Captain Fordo had split the probing force into 4 separate swarms of craft. 2 groups to enter combat from above, and 2 to enter from below. The actual damage these ships did was negligible. But there were few gunships fielded by the Republic which were more maneuverable amongst the densely packed cityscapes of places like Axum and Coruscant than the smaller, agile LE variants. Rancisis hoped this would increase their ability to evade enemy fire and survive the probing of their defenses, his mind focusing more completely upon the run as they closed in on their targets. Right away, Rancisis felt his hopes falter as the above gunships were engaged first. Contrary to what he had suspected, a fair amount of the square tanks deployed by the Imperium were anti-air armaments. Something revealed in hideous fashion as their top-mounted turrets lifted and fired. They spilled hundreds of thousands of thick, almost head-sized rounds of solid ammunition into the sky, the superheated streams of steel moving far faster than blaster rounds ever had a chance to be, and moving into both separate groups of skyward flyers that the Republic had deployed. Right away, Oppo's mind went to work, connecting brains, lending instincts to the gunners and the pilots alike as he sought to help them avoid the hazardous cascade of shells that came hurtling towards them. But he quickly realized that it was for naught, as Master Rancisis came to understand that it was not the volume of the shots they fired that made these platforms deadly, it was their aim. To call them unerring would be an understatement, the rain of shredding bullets not only tracking each gunship with near perfection, but also anticipating their most likely veers of escape, and filling those spaces with death as well. It took less than 9 seconds for all of the gunships that had approached from above to become little more than shredded balls of fire and metal, spinning out and colliding into the surrounding cityscape, or they did not simply detonate in the air. Rancisis felt every single loss, every snuffed mind, and every terrified, doomed thought from the troopers who had survived the initial volley, only to die in the following collisions. But he would not let those lives be in vain, for they had revealed something vital and something he would not soon forget. Approaching as they had to land troops directly onto the rooftops that the Astartes now occupied was blatant suicide. Now he turned his focus on the lower two groups who evaded the anti-air fire of the tanks, becoming the attention of the Space Marines who manned the rims of the towers. This time, the gunships were able to come into effective range of their own weapons, opening up their strafing runs with volleys from their missile launchers and laser cannon turrets. Rancisis sent them all the premonition that, even as they passed their attack runs, they needed to stay below the line of the enemy's anti-air defenses, but it was a warning most would not need to hear. The Space Marines along the edges of the spire opened fire at the exact same moment, most wielding slug throwers which issued forth highly explosive rounds, with a few bringing to bear rapidly dispensing cannons that were not unlike those wielded by the tanks, and even several man-portable air defense systems in the forms of missile and rocket launchers. All of these weapons had devastating effects on the gunships, ripping not only the vessels to pieces in startlingly short order, but even tearing the missiles fired at them from the sky with coordinated flurries of fire which matched the accuracy of the tanks. The Jedi Master realized then that the reports of these Space Marines, how heavily armed they were, and how proficient they had shown themselves to be in battle, was no overstatement. If anything, their prowess had been understated. Not one of the probing craft made it back, even with Rancisis lending them his power and battle meditation. Their firing lines were too tight, their weapons too effective, the Republic's options for approach being far, far too limited. The Jedi Master looked to the sky, thinking to call in a limited bombardment from the reinforcing Star Destroyers, but one glance was all he needed to know that this tactic would be just as costly and nearly as likely to fail. Hovering above them all, the high-orbit airspace of the battle was being actively contended and currently dominated by the behemoth vessels of the Space Marines. Tens of Venators were attempting to surround the comparatively few vessels, but second by second, they were being blown out of the sky. If anything, they needed aid before all of their ship support was spent throwing itself against them.
Captain, I want you to send back an order to Field Command. Tell them to deploy the SPHAs and have them begin reinforcing the Venators in orbit with all the firepower they can. We need to destroy or force away those Imperial capital ships,
ordered Oppo.
Aye, sir. And what about the approach?
Asked the captain.
We are veering down. I am dismissing the notion of a direct assault. Instead, we will safely deploy several levels lower into the spires but outside of their weapons range. We will move our forces up through the tower's levels, and once we come within a certain distance, we will deploy obscurification smoke to isolate their effective reach. Then we will begin fighting our way up towards them, level by level. Once we have enough of their defenses distracted by our forces, I will call in air support to harry them as we push them back.
The legendary Jedi explained.
Right, dispersing the orders now, sir.
Affirmed the clone captain, calming the rest of their large battle group, with Oppo feeling the shift in their direction right away. He knew that Master Coleman wanted fast results, but he would have to settle for the smoke they would soon deploy to block the enemy's ability to aim at the Basilica grounds from here. Rancisis had overseen impossible battles and objectives before, and it was never desperation or the press to rush that availed them victory. Only careful consideration and preservation of forces yielded long-lasting results, and he would win this battle in the same way he had won the siege of Salukami. With serenity, discipline, and faith in the Force, he would cleave through the red chaos of war and match his wits against the battle acumen of the Space Marines. And he would prevail, if the Force willed it. Coleman Kakash watched from his gunship, observing with his underslung eyes as the towers in the distance were gradually crowned with tall plumes of shimmering black smoke. Each rising column emanated from the windows far below their tops, near the center portions of the spires rising in blooming pillars which obscured all that lay above them. The alien Jedi General snorted in mild disapproval, but reined in his emotions. While he had been hoping that Oppo's forces would have been able to engage the Imperials in a more direct and immediate contest, he also knew well enough not to doubt Master Rancisis or his choice in tactics. The Jedi Master gave a final, reluctant grunt and looked down into his own battlefield. He hovered above it inside of his command LAAT, Commander Neo still at his side. He and his forces would wait no longer. After all, the vast army below him had already done as he had ordered them to do. The entire Imperial perimeter around their temple was now secured. Repulsor tanks, walkers, and juggernauts stood or hovered in rings around their final fortification, ready to scramble, fire, and bombard at his command. Standing between and around Coleman's armored support was nearly an entire legion of eager clone troopers, various ranks and subtypes standing proud and at the ready. Flying above the assembled warriors of the Republic were all the various gunships which had carried them here. Gunships where the majority of their fellow Jedi Knights lingered, watching over the entire scene like divine scions, ready to act. At his nod, the command was given, and most of the Force-empowered warriors descended down, taking direct command of the breaching squads and shock troops. Those brave clones who would be the first into the cracks and access points of the religious fortress which loomed before them. The whole place was locked up tight, every shutter closed, the internal landing bays sealed, even the pillboxes and turret emplacements having been boarded up with bands of folding metal. But none of those barriers would remain in place for long. This Kakash knew well. He was moments, mere moments from ordering the first penetrative salvos when something utterly unexpected occurred. Something that had Coleman's alien eyes swiveling and bobbing on the ends of their low stalks. The front gates of the Basilica began to screech, the enormous figures carved into them swinging open to lend passage not to the Legion outside, but to some force from within.
Prepare for them.
Coleman ordered down to all his forces through his communications bead. The sounds of thousands of blaster rifles and orienting laser cannons being angled towards the doors filled the air densely. The clones giving a resounding shout as captains gave their orders and sergeants ensured they were carried out. But where Coleman expected a suicidal charge of hundreds or even thousands of desperate Imperials, he once more found his predictions subverted. Only a single figure emerged from the depths of the Basilica, lumbering, massive in size and bulk. For what that figure lacked in companions, it clearly made up for with enormous size, armor, and armament. What Master Kakash could only assume to be some kind of massive droid began to stomp its way out of the Basilica, clanking and thumping. Its movements were, at once, rigid in fashion, yet somehow bearing an odd, subtle smoothness. An intention within the details of its forward march that Kakash was unused to seeing in any, save perhaps the likes of General Grievous and the ruinous bounty hunter known as Dirge. Its armor was purple in color and covered in imperial livery and words of various kinds. Its shape was almost box-like, despite the relative nimbleness with which it was moving, but by far its most notable features were those found at its center and those which composed its chosen weapon. In one of its enormous, gauntlet-like hands, the machine was carrying an absolutely colossal blade. The sword was easily taller than the being wielding it was, lines of sparking lightning and power coursing up and down the length of the weapon. And in the center of its boxy body was what appeared to be a coffin, engraved with a human skeleton at rest, arms crossed over its chest. This strange sarcophagus ended in what appeared for all the world to be a skull-like helmet, which tilted and turned to regard the army as it emerged. Naturally, Coleman had only a few moments to observe the lumbering machine before the clones and tanks opened fire upon it, taking aim and dispensing death as soon as the Imperial droid exited the building. Thousands of rifles began pouring a rain of blazing blue into its resilient hull, and green bolts and beams began to find it as laser cannons and composite lasers were primed and readied. The machine warrior stood against it for only a handful of seconds, most of the prayer scrolls which were mounted across its body burning up, its Imperial feet only managing to stagger and stumble partway down the stairs leading up to the entrance before the entire construct was forced down to its knees. The droid-like walker kneeled into the shadow of its weapon, hull blazing as it slammed the blade of its enormous sword into the stone beneath it. An act the Jedi thought symbolized their victory over it, a belief which was dispelled less than a second later. As soon as the war machine did this, Coleman was forced to shield his sensitive eyes, closing them and turning away as the walker exploded into a radiant corona of energy. Or at least, it seemed to explode, though more and more, Master Kakash was doubting that this had actually occurred. Fire continued to be poured against it, rockets and mass drivers being thrown into the volley, and yet, soon, the brilliance being released from the target had intensified so much that Kakash could not block it out even with his eyelids closed and his eyes covering over his stalks. Within only a few moments, no one could stand to look at the source of light long enough to aim their weapons at it without going blind.
Hold your fire! Hold your fire!
Kakash yelled into his comms device, and shortly after, his orders were followed, the now largely inaccurate shots dying down rapidly, clones and Jedi groaning and covering their faces. And yet, when Kakash's eyes began to recover, he was shocked to see that the bipedal Imperial machine was still intact. Kneeling where it had stopped, a shimmering shell of energy slowly dimming around its body. Even after the shield had vanished, the mechanical warrior did not rise, did not attack, and did not make any overt movement. Master Coleman Kakash found himself puzzled, his irregular eyes regaining their clarity faster than those of his human clones and several of his Jedi fellows. What was the nature of this droid warrior? Was it meant as some kind of emissary, someone the Imperials had sent to surrender, or was it truly just another pointlessly aggressive weapon?
Keep your guard up. Order our forces to return fire into it the moment it seems hostile, or I give the command. And take me down there. I need to be the one to confront it.
Ordered Master Coleman.
General, I hardly think that's...
Commander Neo began to say.
That is an order, Commander Neo. Execute.
The Jedi Master asserted. The clone hesitated for a moment, but then nodded reluctantly and went further into the cabin to contact the pilot. In moments, the LAAT gunship was hovering over the scene, and Coleman Kakash was jumping off, landing closest to the odd machine, rising with a flourish and activating his green lightsaber. The Jedi Master approached and was about to speak when, suddenly, it spoke instead, blaring out a sentence in Galactic Basic through several loudspeakers built into its bulky hull.
Are you lord among these witches and false men?
The walker asked in a deep, resonating voice. Coleman's eyes swiveled somewhat, but he nodded his head, slowly approaching the kneeling dreadnought.
I am commanding officer here, yes,
said the alien, sweeping his saber out probingly, squinting as his blade touched across the invisible shield. His sword of light's glowing tip revealed its boundary, the aegis illuminating once more with a bright white phosphorus shine. He could see the plasma cycling in his blade being absorbed rapidly, his saber shrinking momentarily, bobbing against the touch of the shield as the fifth form of matter which composed it was drained out and then replenished by his own kyber crystal.
And what precisely are you? An emissary? A droid?
Coleman asked in return, taking a step back and watching as the radiance retreated once more. He could hear it now. A high-pitched buzz, potentially beyond what humans could pick up, yet this close he could not help but notice it. The shield was converting matter, even plasma, which made contact with it into raw light, and though Coleman Kakash was never a deeply technological Jedi, he had to appreciate the strangeness of this method of shielding technology.
I am Sebastian Vondrel, Arch-Imbalancer of the Tempered Hands chapter of the Emperor's Angels of Death,
responded the large, mechanized man, its skull-faced helmet tilting ever so slightly to track Coleman as the Jedi Master began to pace back and forth in front of the machine.
And while I am now composed of more iron than meager flesh, I remain, as I have always been, a human man, and an Adeptus Astartes. I am no machine. I am empowered by them.
It rumbled. This had Coleman blinking in renewed surprise, pausing his pacing as he observed Sebastian with new understanding. He also could not help but notice the damage upon the carapace of the evidently entombed warrior, or rather, the lack thereof. The blaster fire, even before the shield had been raised, had done next to nothing, failing to scorch anything other than the prayer scrolls which clung to the Space Marine's hull. The heavier laser cannons had managed to leave shallow impact craters in several places, which still smoked and glowed dully with residual heat. A continued bombardment of those weapons would have worn it down in a few seconds, and had succeeded in shoving the mech around. Yet it seemed that the shield had been raised before too much effectual damage could actually be inflicted, and the missiles and mass drivers of the clones had been entirely warded off by the technology within the Space Marine's iron body. It was an impressive display, but not one which would enable this warrior to challenge the forces arrayed before him, and if the Imperial dared to rise from his kneeling position, Coleman knew he would not last more than 15 seconds at best.
You are a Space Marine. You're larger than I'd imagined, and a full far more outnumbered.
Kakash stated, waving his free hand back over the assembled army.
I assume you've come to surrender.
The Jedi Master concluded.
Incorrect.
The Space Marine announced at once. Kakash took a step back, the machine's joints beginning to rumble.
I am an angel of death, and I have not come to surrender,
spoke the ancient warrior.
Then why have you come?
Yelled Kakash, the men all around him re-centering their weapons to the best of their ability, many still blinking spots out of their eyes.
I have come to destroy you. They have deployed some kind of smoke. It is black and shimmering, and it is blocking our auto senses and direct targeting augury arrays,
reported Force Commander Belarus Harfan. The Force Commander stood amongst the many busy serfs of the chapter as they moved the munition, prepared and manned tanks and turrets, and continued arming the Melta charges. All of his battle brothers, the recently enhanced Marines of the Tempered Hands chapter, were armed and out, ready to repel another attack with extreme prejudice. Before him was the only Marine not holding a gun, the captain of the 9th Company, Desporus Taltan.
Then they are trying to obscure our vision of the Basilica. Is the new spirit connection we have with Sebastian compromised?
asked the captain, himself seated in a deployed command nodule, wires and cables linking thickly into his head, the powerful machinery around him extending various sensor probes and rotating dishes into the air, which bobbed and waved of their own accord.
No, Captain. It seems that their countermeasure is not sufficient to sever that link, especially not with the Wing of Iron directly overhead. The Republic is moving its forces rapidly up towards us, however. I estimate a 98.2% chance of engaging them in less than 7 minutes,
said Belarus.
Very good. All is progressing according to the predictions of the Temperance Engine and the Arch Imbalancer,
was the 9th Captain's response.
Keep an eye on their activities to the best of your ability and lead the counterattack on them once their initial assault has begun. Fall back and allow them to occupy zones 7 through 9. Get as many that close as you can, but do not allow them to penetrate zones 6 and under. I will continue to coordinate firing solutions with the Imbalancer. Current estimates dictate a 74.8% chance that his battle will begin at the same time as our own. I intend to have closed the margins of death by an additional 12.9% effectiveness by then,
the venerable Space Marine ordered.
As you will it, 9th Captain. We will not fail in our precision. We will prove our worth to the chapter,
announced the Force Commander, slamming his hammer-bearing fist against his chest before turning and rallying his command squad, leading them personally down to where their battle was soon to begin. The 9th Captain nodded, a trickle of amusement sliding through the circuits and neurons of his augmented brain. He had been one of the most vocal when it came to questioning the statistical wisdom of embracing the gifts of the Lord Commander of the Imperium so readily. But these new Marines, while lacking in some doctrine, made up for it with zeal and a burning desire to become equal amongst their existing battle brothers of the chapter. In his mind, he could see these new Primaris Marines developing splendidly, and his own transformed body was adapting rapidly to his old augmentations. The Jedi had faced the wrath of the Firstborn and had been found wanting. Now they would be confronted by the keen tactics of the newly elevated Tempered Hands, and Captain Desporus had little doubt they would be found wanting once more. He was fast coming to accept that none could withstand the might of the Rubicon. None could survive it, save those who had crossed it. However, he pushed those thoughts aside for now, and focused on his own task. His mind was relayed up into the Wing of Iron, and then through the Temperance Engine itself, before being sent back down to the planet below, connecting directly with the mind of his de facto chapter master. Already he was receiving the indirect targeting solutions he would need to be effective in spite of the countermeasure that the Republic was throwing against them. Desporus did not need to voice any further commands, did not need to give any orders out loud at all. The honored chapter serfs of his armored company received their instructions through the implants within their brains, the same ones that enabled them to connect to their vaunted war machines. The whirlwinds began to turn their heads, empowered men standing beside them, ready to rapidly reload the tanks with their specialized munitions, which stood in tall stacks only an arm's reach away. They had enough power to level the entire basilica and everything around it 9 times over. With precision, the 9th Captain of the Tempered Hands corrected the turreted heads, moving them ever so slightly, personally programming each warhead with its destined coordinates. They were the storm of iron. They were the hail of fire. And he was the eye of the storm, staring down, ready to strike. Sebastian's mind was a maze of history, theory, flesh, and iron. It was a cage in which he trapped all factors and bent them to his will by the strength of pure, bladed logic. Simultaneous calculations ran between the canyons of his intact gray matter like cold water, his augmentations sieving away all fallacy with the unrelenting nature of the will that was born within him. His dual-phase shield, a relic of the heresy, had drained almost a sixth of the power reserves provided by his immensely strong plasmic reactors. This would have constituted a serious problem if he intended to be within prolonged combat. But that was not the case this time, and he gladly took the loss of power as more than sufficient sacrifice for what he was about to do. He eyed the Jedi alien who strutted before him through his multi-spectrum Auspex arrays that now served as his eyes. He powered his joints and servos, those portions of his new, enhanced body whirring and moaning as they were brought fully online in preparation for what he was sure would be an inevitability.
And how do you expect to destroy me?
Asked the Witch Lord, green skin rippling with colors that were not truly visible, but rather representations of temperature changes. The thing was chastened by Sebastian's threat, but bold enough to challenge it. This amused the human parts of the Space Marine, but for his iron mind, it was no more than pointless bluster. The Arch-Imbalancer did not engage in bluffs or idle taunts.
I will call the whirlwind, and it will sweep you all away.
He answered simply, voice rumbling in the air.
In the spirit of preservation, I will make you one offer, Witch Knight. Retreat from this place. Leave it be. If you do, then you will live. If you do not, then you will be destroyed,
said Sebastian, extending Gulliman's mercy through his ultimatum. But he only offered it so openly because he knew it would be denied, and so it was. The alien knight did not even seem to pause to consider it, shaking his odd, upside-down skull and clicking in his throat.
We are the Jedi. We do not fear the wind nor the storm. We do not shirk from the lead of the Republic. Surrender to us, and we will ensure you are treated fairly. Before being brought to trial and made to answer for the crimes you have committed against this planet, consider this your one offer, Space Marine. Take it, or you'll become one with the Force.
The Jedi Master threatened back.
You will, Jedi,
pronounced the old warrior, some bemusement leaking into his robotic tone.
We will not surrender.
The witch snapped back rapidly, almost angrily. The dreadnought's head turned from side to side in a denial.
No, witch. You will not surrender. You will learn to fear the storm. My storm. My whirlwinds.
The Arch-Imbalancer clarified. Sebastian had timed his spoken words with the information being streamed through his mind by the powerful Noospheric connection he was linked into. The Jedi's alien, stalk eyes widening for a moment as he sensed the danger, but failed to grasp its nature. He raised his blade wardingly toward Sebastian, expecting the strike to come from him, only for the first volley from the whirlwind artillery tanks to fall, all at once, in perfect synchronicity around them. The initial attack was nowhere near Vondrel himself, a heavy layer of armor-piercing explosive rockets falling in a ring around the outermost line of the Republic's assembled encirclement. Chaos began its reign then, as massive explosions and flames began to geyser out from the heaviest surrounding vehicles, each and every single missile precisely aimed and guided down into the backs of the Republic's heavy armor. Red mushroom clouds expanded up from where the armor was too thick to penetrate, but far more terrible were the effective missiles, venting the same kind of devastation into the interiors of tens of tanks. The titanic juggernauts fielded by the Republic absorbed the damage admirably, but even they, with their shielding and specialized armors, could not withstand such a densely packed attack. Their roofs rupturing and exploding in cascading, glorious fashion. Wheels detonated and melted, turrets were blown off of armored shells, and command centers were eviscerated and filled with purifying flames. Death rained down on the clones for nearly 5 entire seconds, missile after missile cramming itself into the hollowed husks of the behemoth tanks. and ripping legged vehicles apart, creating a wall of burning, melting wrecks which surrounded the assembled force in steel-eating pyres of Alpha Primus grade promethium. Focus was dragged out and away from the kneeling arch-imbalancer, shockwaves from the blasts rippling across the mass of white soldiers and hovering tanks like disturbances in water. Over half the clones and Jedi assembled were thrown from their feet, several of their lighter vehicles being blown away end over end into their masses, crushing any unfortunates enough to not have the force to aid their escape. The army was rocked, deafened, and shocked by the hell wrought within the prolonged cacophony, the first of many. So shocked were they, Replicae and Witch Knights both, that they failed to maintain their focus on Sebastian. A lethal error in their discipline, but one which was understandable, even predicted, as the Dreadnought now demonstrated brutally. He rose, double-layered shield dissolving as he did, his servos heated, his body prepared for the exertions to come. This new form of his, this brutalis pattern Dreadnought, was a marvel. Never before had Sebastian felt so powerful, not even in his former body of steel. The venerable encasement of his former Dreadnought had been powerful, durable, but slow, ancient. Sluggish to respond to his thoughts, movements always failing to capture even half of the grace he had wielded in life. This was different. The neural links that now synced him with the war machine his body had become sank deep, deep into his mind, providing a reactivity and fearsome dexterity that harkened him back to his time before his first death. He gloried in it, made full use of it, even though he knew that this very link, the same technology that would enable the impossible, was also a poison. Each wire, each newly crafted Mechanicus fiber, was a dangerous river of corrosion which would, in time, erode him into nothing. That was why he constrained himself, why he had descended from the heavier weapons of his recent past to the pure simplicity of his blade. Sebastian Vondrel swept his sword horizontally. The Jedi Master he had been conversing with only now turning back to see the strike coming. Impressively, the comparatively tiny warrior caught the Arch-Imbalancer's Siegebreaker Warblade with his own green sword. And even more impressively, the weapon held its integrity against his own. Yet, the same could not be said for the feat of the warrior behind it, as the Jedi Witch Lord was batted away tens of meters into the air and back into the mass of his army. Clones began to return fire on him, but he barely gave them an opportunity to sight their shots, charging down into them, offhand batting away a missile fired in his direction as his chest-mounted dual storm bolters began their assault, ripping into the infantry who stood before them. They were raked with hundreds of exploding rounds, fired at a rate which turned them into white-clad gore and clouds of blood before the Arch-Imbalancer himself was among them. He swept his enormous relic blade through their lines like a reaper, utterly annihilating most who were caught in his path with the oversized power field his warblade was wreathed within, atomizing the bodies of any clones in his way and most Jedi. Those witches who survived did so by evasion, or by blocking his enormous weapon with their own, shoving other soldiers aside with their warp abilities to make way as they skidded over the ground. One of the Knights of Jedi leapt up, twirling in the air before landing on the flat of Sebastian's sword, running up it and towards him. In response, the Master of the Tempered Hands flared his power sword's field, transforming the warrior into screaming ashes, not even pausing to consider the act as the Space Marine swept his blade through the blackened cloud that was once the Jedi. His stride never broke as he continued his attack, bolters blitzing with fire and rage, mechanical legs defiantly lithe against his bulk as he passed the sword through even more Republic soldiers. The clone forces and even some of the tanks began to focus their attacks against him, but now that he was in close, among the crowd as it were, They were forced to temper their volleys, unable to simply assail him as they had, without destroying all the men around Sebastian. All the while, the Arch-Imbalancer was being updated as to what would happen next, thanks to the linked mind of his ninth captain. Sebastian's massive body spun and crouched, avoiding two whistling blasts from mass driver cannons which slammed into the Basilica walls behind him, reaping the lives of another squadron of Replicae with the same movement. He then leapt forward, running into and not away from the speeding form of a hovering tank, its turret spinning to face him and firing point blank into the Arch-Imbalancer's iron body. But Sebastian had grasped the lip of the tank with his offhand, easily lifting the light vehicle up, the shots sailing over him as they were fired, the body of the tank now used as a makeshift shield. Deflectors and hull bursting and buckling as two other volleys from laser cannons and missiles collided into it. He then lifted the smoking wreck even higher, composite lasers from gunships high above strafing over it, slicing chunks out of the wreckage before the Dreadnought Lord contemptuously tossed what was left of the war machine aside, flipping it back onto the faces of the clones who had fired missiles at him. The masses of Replicae and Jedi around him were shocked, and in those few bare faces, the old Astartes could see the recognizable signs of transhuman terror blossoming like fell roses across each expression. He knew what they must be thinking, what thoughts were sweltering their minds and making so many hesitate. How could anything as large as him move like that? How could a construct of steel and ceramite that stood in excess of 13 feet tall bob and dodge and wield a sword as he was doing? He took a grim satisfaction in that. Yes, let them marvel. Let them fear! Let them suffer the glory of the Lord Commander's designs and the wrath of his greater father ever behind them all. He became their will, incarnate in ceramite and iron, rounding on the enemy without ever breaking his stride or showing any mercy. And he was not alone. The gunships of the Republic began to hover over him, crowding him like loitering vultures. The tempered hands did not suffer such things, however, and soon the second volley fell from the air, exploding well above the battle and scattering fist-sized balls of ceramite at sonic speeds. The sudden, sky-filling attack struck the gunships like birdshot fired into a dense pack of Cessian pigeons. The Republic craft jerking, wings breaking, engine shattering, missile stores detonating. They descended, spinning like burning fallen angels, crashing into the soldiers and tanks beneath them. One such gunship twisted in the air, free-falling into the Arch-Imbalancer's direction, only to be punched from the sky with his free, mauled fist, smashed into 3 burning pieces as the Dreadnought continued his grisly work, and found himself locked in a duel with the Jedi all around him. They were growing accustomed now, and he admired how so many of them shunted off the fear and the chaos all around them, minds honed onto the task of defeating him. Had they been contending with a mere Redemptor, a casual warrior encased in Brutalis armoring and machinery, then they may have succeeded. But as they began to surround him, outmaneuver him, carve into him, they found their burning blades halted and brought up short. Their swift strikes did a fine job of shearing away his ceramite skin wherever they attacked, but failed to bite into the refined adamantium skeleton which hid within. For Sebastian was the venerable first among equals who ruled the tempered hands, and his war gear was a reflection of his status. His neurons surged with the power of command, scorching him with ecstatic control as he spun, his torso rotating unnaturally to throw them off, and catching 2 with the arc of his blade as he did, crushing a third in his free hand, crumpling the body of the Jedi like a bloody pile of twigs. However, as he ended his spin, he planted his blade into the ground, shield flaring to life and blinding the Jedi Knights and clones who struck at him. One unwise warrior leapt into the field itself, unable to avert his path before it was too late. He fell into the conversion layer of the dual-phase shield and the effect was blinding and instantaneous. He screamed in desperate pain, body pulled apart as the matter which composed his airborne form was converted into bright, shimmering light. He fell to the ground, only half a man now, ignored by his comrades as the Jedi sought to surround Sebastian anew, waiting for his defense to fall once more. But before it did, something else fell instead. The third volley. A combination of more armor-piercing rockets and promethium-spewing munitions. The former slammed into the legged tanks of the Republic, seeking to mop up those which remained in direct challenge to the Arch-Imbalancer, while the latter detonated overhead and rained literal, unquenchable fire upon the army beneath them. Jedi and clones began to scream, began to burn, and then die en masse. Half of them started to attempt a retreat, evidently realizing the trap they had fallen into and the kill zone that was wearing them down moment by moment. But those wiser warriors would find themselves impaired, even entrapped, as they struggled to cross the flaming ring of molten super heavy tanks which encircled the entire battlefield. And aside from that, Sebastian was not done with them yet, not by a long shot. More gunships flew in, attempting to pull their soldiers out or to strafe the Arch-Imbalancer as he lifted himself once more. But these Republic vessels were intercepted by vast wings of Thunderhawks and support ships, the very same who would soon be landing all around the Basilica to effect the sorely needed evacuation. Twin-linked heavy bolters, las cannons, and worse were unleashed, ripping through the paltry armor of the Republic air support, downing even more of them as Sebastian resumed his titanic sword dance. It was not long after that when the confused floundering and fighting of the Replicate became an all-out rout, the men either realizing individually or informed through their comms that the battle was a useless one. Even if they killed Sebastian, this would not end. This would not stop. He was but a fearsome lure, with their true enemies being too far behind to actually reach. But that did not hold back the Dreadnought's vengeful blade, chasing down Jedi and clones, ruining them, cleaving them, tearing the witches and their slaves asunder. More volleys fell, more tanks exploded, more of the Republic died with each successive whirlwind strike. He allowed them no quarter or escape from the quagmire he had created, bounding between groups of fleeing survivors, expending his storm bolters and blackening the blood of countless false men. 5 minutes after the battle had begun, it was over, and the Arch-Imbalancer found himself lulling in the fight, no foes remaining alive and near enough to challenge him. Already the Thunderhawks and transport ships were seeking to land all around the Basilica, Space Marines hopping down from them to start clearing landing zones, and Tech Marines of his chapter approaching from several directions to begin examining the damage which coated his smoking, glowing carapace. He made to start pursuing what survivors he could still detect, the battlefield around him an absolute ruin of fire, craters, and stacked bodies. But before he could take more than 9 steps, he received a new communication, though this time not from his 9th captain.
This is Sebastian.
He droned as he accepted the new Noospheric connection.
Honored Elder, Arch-Imbalancer, this is First Captain Heldris Torv, and I bear grave news. A virus bomb has been deployed within the Basilica, the one housed within the Chapel of Salvation. It is currently descending to the lower levels of the planet.
Came the report, sounding from within his very skull.
What is the time to detonation?
Was Sebastian's immediate follow-up question.
Under 9 minutes, sir. The soldiers delivering the report claim that the Canoness Superior threw herself after it, and they seem confident that she will stop it somehow. However,
the disembodied voice of the first captain continued to say,
that is not assurance enough. Prepare for immediate evacuation. We will be able to withdraw only the first wave. Have them ready, Captain Heldris. We leave as soon as it is possible, and we shall not be able to return.
This was madness, and with a sinking grimness, the Jedi Master realized that she and her comrades were the only thing that stood against it. Her Jedi blood burned, thousands of years of war echoing inside of her, telling her but one thing. Here had stood Master Zalo. Here had stood Master Farfalla. Here had stood Master Vodo Siosk Bas. And here now stood Master Ayla Secura, perhaps not facing down a true Sith, but something that was in many ways even worse, representing within black, cruel eyes the very heart of darkness. His power bit into the netherworld itself, his metaphorical teeth sharp enough to make the very Force shudder and withdraw. She herself felt a tremor run through her, panting, sweat slicking her densely as she stood over the burning body of Jedi Master Hishro Taij. Black flames devouring his flesh, biting through his body, forcing howls of rasping pain from his lips, his eyes looking at her, begging for release, begging for mercy. Yet there was only one mercy Ayla could give him, now that the fire had him, and he knew it too, and begged in agonized, wordless screams for it. His face was aflame, his tongue devoured already, his every breath pulling the dark fires deeper into his body. Ayla felt tears wet her eyes, but her face was hard as she swung down and cut the head off of the Master, his decapitation ending the fires almost instantly. Eyes stinging, she looked up and centered her sight on the diabolical force they were attempting to contend with. The Jedi had been throwing themselves at him, trying to wear Tarweiler down, attacking him with force, saber, and skill in equal measure. But he danced around them, bent time and space with mere flickers of his thoughts. One moment behind them, the next above. He struck with his bare hands, each blow as weighty as a falling star, his black blade no longer required, if it ever had been at all. And yet, those warriors he slapped to pieces were among the luckiest, their ends coming quickly and with far less pain than that of the others. Every technique, every strategy, every lightsaber form, everything the Jedi could use against him spattered against his unnatural agility and ability to warp reality like rain upon a powered deflector shield. And even at the height of their assault, it was evident that Tarweiler was no more than toying with them. He struck right and left, Tarsis Khan crying out as he was slapped across the chest, his voice cut short as his force shield buckled and he was sent spinning, broken into the wall. Weiler kicked right, his foot sinking into the face of Master Jesora Taup like it might have through whipped cream, destroying her mid-strike, his leg following through to stomp onto the ground. Gore spattering from him and leaving him unnaturally clean as his free hand caught the saber and threw it directly at Ayla's chest. She was several meters away at this point, but even then, she barely had the reflexes in her to catch the speeding blade, snatching it out of the air with a spin and grasping it by its handle. The glowing bar of light seared her shoulder, but nothing else, and she harnessed that pain and enacted her retribution. The Jedi Master screamed in rage, her dispassion dispelled, finishing her spin and hurtling the saber back, throwing it like a spinning glaive which sliced the air back in his direction. But as with so much that had already occurred, it was for naught, the Inquisitor rolling his midnight eyes, causing the yellow saber to veer off his path and to the right with a casual ease which could not but invoke despair in her. But the saber was caught again, yanked from the air by Master Quinlan Voss, who spun with it, green blade held in his primary hand as he re-engaged the Inquisitor. Lidless eyes red and fiery with a need for vengeance. Her former master challenged the tall, monstrous man directly, standing before the fell face of the enemy, several more Jedi coming to his aid. The Inquisitor bobbed and weaved, his form buzzing, blurring, shifting in the air impossibly as the insane Imperial laughed and laughed. He ducked another of Quinlan's twin strikes, and as he came up again, his hands lit ablaze with that horrific black fire, an arc of it issuing from his fingers and palms, and colliding with the 3 Jedi who were upon him. Voss drew in his power, almost puppeting his own body with the Force alone as he assumed a Vapad stance and spun his blades, catching the flames and hurtling them around his body with great effort. The other 2 Jedi had no such countermeasures, the waves of dark flame catching them and burning through them, leaving them screaming and half intact onto the ground. Quinlan stepped over and around them as he continued his contest, speeding his strikes with renewed power. Master Voss was one of the most pragmatic and powerful fighters in the entire Jedi Order. This Ayla knew to be a fact, and yet their enemy made dodging her former master's attacks look trivial, almost effortless, sliding past Voss's green and yellow sabers like oil within water, swimming around a stirring spoon. Voss was reaching speeds and strengths he had never revealed to her before, even wounded as he was. He was doing as she was, she realized, seemingly feeding on his own pain, but it was not enough.
Come now, you must swing faster than that. I am barely moving. Come on, Jedi Knight, faster! Dance faster!
The creature called Wyler mocked as he weaved around another combination, backhanding Voss in the maneuver's crescendo. The black flames in the monster's palms wet out as he performed the strike, reigniting a moment later. The Jedi's head snapped around, but his force shield held strong against the hammering strike, whirling with the force of it to absorb the damage and coming right back at the enemy. The Inquisitor was making it clear that Quinlan was surviving the bout on nothing more than his humor, for all it took was a single lick of the flames to ensure an inescapable doom for any Jedi they touched. All around the 2 dueling figures were scattered the smoldering, black fire-seared bodies of Ayla's Order. Over 100 Jedi at least, while almost 200 more voiced howls and cries of pain, their bodies being consumed by the fires this fell creature had struck them with. The flames appeared to feed on the Force itself, becoming inextinguishable once they caught onto a Force wielder's body, burning until their lives were expended. But once the Jedi died, the fires would falter before vanishing completely. The technique was an atrocious one, giving Ayla the sense that it was not only the bodies of its victims which were burned and consumed by these obsidian flames, but their very presence in the Force as well. Quinlan bellowed, waves of concussive force blasting from him and driving the other Jedi back, though his opponent didn't feel them or react to them at all as bodies and sabers were sent sprawling in all directions. The contending Jedi was reeking with the dark side, his eyes blazing with increasing hatred. Ayla wished she could try to temper him, to pull him back from the shadowy edge he was skirting. But how could she ask him to die in such a horrific way in place of risking falling to the dark side? No, she turned her mind to something more conducive, rescuing him from this suicidal duel before the Inquisitor tired of his own terrible game. But how? She looked around at the other Jedi nearby, the ones who were not burning, who yet remained to fight. How many of them could she rely on, when so much fear now festered in their eyes? No, she would not allow that to deter her. Instead, she used it to screen them. Who among them had more serenity or fury than fear? They would be her soldiers, the ones to help her rescue her master. But how? How? The idea struck her like a sudden inspiration.
Jedi, to me, gather!
She called out, the others of her order who could still answer coming to her location right away. Ayla scrutinized them, selecting from those who would suit her purposes before sharing her plan. It was not hard to convince the other Jedi. After all, they had tried everything else already. Plan in place, They broke apart into two teams, either running to the opposite sides and invoking the Force. Ayla jumped from the ground and landed at an unnatural angle upon the wall, beginning to run across the side of the makeshift prison, shifting her inertia by her mastery within the metaphysical. The agile Twi'lek Jedi leapt past the doors and holes which impeded her, as though they were easily avoided pits, gaining speed all the while. To her left and right, other Jedi followed, blades burning, wounds born of their capture and imprisonment bleeding as they sped after her, eyes full of focus, rage, and the will to avenge themselves. She could feel it all within them without looking at those who followed after her, these sensations now very much a part of her plan. Across from her was another squad of Jedi, all doing much as she was on the other wall, converging on the black shape before them, the shadowy Inquisitor still engaged and fighting with her master. Out of all the Jedi who rushed to directly confront Tarweiler, Voss had been the only one to survive in prolonged combat. It would have been more impressive, yet, once more, the Inquisitor slapped the Jedi Master with the back of his other hand, laughing as Quinlan was staggered, the Jedi stumbling back before rebounding to attack once more. But the Imperial's callous arrogance would prove his ultimate undoing. She and the other Jedi raced to the flanks of the dueling warriors and leapt. Their minds were joined, the flanking knights all falling in and around the Inquisitor, Voss sliding back in response to Ayla's telepathic warning. A warning she knew he would need, for this was no mere pincer attack. The ruthless knights and masters twisted and contorted their bodies as they closed in, thoughts in perfect sync with one another as they all performed mutual states of battle meditation, summoning it forth to whatever degree they could. Knowledge, a Jedi's first and most subtle weapon, wove between them like fine lotus threads, spinning together to create something far stronger and far more precise. Normally, only 4 or 5, perhaps 6 Jedi, if their size is permitted, could attack a single target with lightsabers at once without getting in each other's way. But now, 27 Jedi shut closed their trap around Tarweiler. Bodies and blades conjoining like puzzle pieces, spinning and lunging into an acrobatic display which formed a near-perfect sphere of bodies around their enemy, all holding sabers, all angled in. The maneuver was perfect, inescapable, and Ayla felt a renewed sense of vicious vigor spill into her as she saw their attacks land home. 31 lightsaber blades pierced Tarweiler from every direction, his body suddenly riddled with bars of burning light. His mind had reached out in the last moments, expelling power to repel them, but like a tightly woven net, the conjoined Jedi had pulled upon each other as they attacked and overcame the exhalation of strength the Inquisitor had attempted to shield himself with. His face was still trapped in a grin, but he was not laughing anymore, and the smile was a hollow thing. But then, the laugh resumed, yet not from the man before her. The man caught between them seemed to waver and then faded from existence, his empty smile vanishing to reveal something which stole Ayla's breath away. She was stabbing into the Jedi across from her. In fact, most of them had impaled each other, skewering their fellow members in a crossfire she had been sure they had been careful to avoid. In panic, the Master Jedi tried to pull away, several others mimicking her, drawing their sabers out of their comrades, and sometimes pulling themselves off of the burning blades that they themselves had been struck with. Most collapsed in a pile where their enemy should have been, while others lasted longer, bearing the woundings long enough to step away before falling to their knees and curling over. Those spared the touch of a lightsaber numbered only 5, Ayla Secura among them. She felt her strength collapsing out of her, the air in her lungs stolen as she saw the body of the other Jedi she had impaled, likely onto dying. "How did you?" She began to gasp, her head turning almost limply to follow the incessant laughter. The Inquisitor was smugly leaning on a rail near to the stairs, eyeing them all with deep amusement, hands wreathed in black flames. "How
now? Oh dear. Don't you realize it yet? I knew what you would do because you told me about it.
The Imperial said, his voice thick with superiority. The Jedi Master had no idea what he meant by that until, with a suddenness which threatened to throw her off her feet, she realized that her combat meditation was still linked to the mind of one other Jedi who had not lost their focus. No, not a Jedi at all. Tar Weiler's shark-toothed smile grew wider as he saw the epiphany strike her. The knowledge that he had infiltrated their combat trance from the get-go, slicing into her like a cruel carver's knife. "You were never even there," she whispered.
Oh, no. What I did was more than a mere illusion. You fools do not even realize it yet, but I have been in your minds from the start of this pathetic little contest. Your barriers are so weak, I don't even need to break them for me to subvert your very thoughts. I can just slide inside like water seeping through cracks. You, your master Quinlan Voss, all of your dead and dying Jedi friends.
The Inquisitor gloated as he pushed off the railing and began to stalk forward.
Now, the game has grown tiresome. It is time, I think, to pack you up. Kneel. I'll make this part painless if you do not resist.
He purred past the dagger-like teeth which filled his grinning mouth. Quinlan Voss trembled from head to toe, but his face showed no fear as he spat and lifted his blade, sword humming hungrily in the air. "You will not take her, or any of us. I do not know why you came, or how you gained this power, but I will stop you!" he declared, charging back in, blades spinning in a frenzy of flashing movements.
That's the spirit!
The Inquisitor mocked as he rushed in to meet Quinlan, moving in like a phantom, ducking around and avoiding the blades which chased him. Voss worked through another 6 strikes, but he could not even scorch Weiler's robe. Another strike, then an 8th, before Tar halted the 9th. The green blade swinging down to chop into his shoulder and through his torso, paused by an upraised, clawed hand, the space around it warped and distorted with purple and black coloration.
Still so slow! Still so weak!
The Inquisitor snarled as Voss pushed down with all his might.
Are you really this pathetic? Or do you simply not want it enough?
Tar Weiler scolded, pulsing the power in his hand and sending Voss skidding back a few feet.
Let me reveal to you then some of the reason behind the madness you think you are fighting.
The Inquisitor gloated, following after the Jedi he had pushed away, hands blazing black, whips of unnatural fire curling out from him and slapping across the ground. He raised his arms, lashing at Quinlan, who was forced once more to fall into painful vapad just to stand a chance. He deflected one whip, and then the other, rolling back from the strokes as the tongues of flames twisted around his blades, nearly licking him across the face and chest. Both sabers now held within these coils of unreal, void-like power. He was pulled taut and reeled in, closer and closer despite his resistance, attempting to keep his distance.
There will be no victory here, on this foul little planet. Every Imperial soldier will die. Every Space Marine sent down to its wretched surface will die. Every hero under the Empire who remains will die,
said the insane man, pulling Voss closer and closer. The Jedi grit his teeth at the words, an eternal glare dark over his every feature. That cannot be true! You are an Imperial! Why would you do that to your own people? The Jedi growled as he was brought almost right into the Inquisitor's face, his arms pulled out to either side.
fool! Can you really not fathom the reason? Even now?
Tarweiler mocked.
We are the Imperium of Man. We do not lack for soldiers, space marines, or heroes. They are created and spent every day, all for the greater victory. When the others hear about what occurred, when they see those blood-red names listed as the Fallen, they will blame the Republic. Those who seek isolation and peace will be silenced, forced to capitulate to a greater conflict. A conflict which shall deliver unto us this entire galaxy and the strength we need for true unity. And besides, the loss to us will be painful, but insubstantial. Can you say the same?
He hissed, his breath the scent of burning corpses rolling over Quinlan's bloody face.
What are you talking about?
The Jedi Master grunted and groaned, trying to pull in his arms, trying to get his sabers free of the flames which held him spread.
Do you really think I do not intend to take my toll from your Republic as well? You are fools, all of you. You have gathered all of your psycho witches into one place. All of your heroes, all of your best. We will bleed from the loss, but you will die from it. Your Republic will leave this battle with nothing. No Jedi, no replicae, none save those who could not be fielded. I will cleave your order unto death in the same blow that I stir my Imperium into righteous war. The galaxy will burn. The Republic's body will be the kindling. The Jedi, the first to scream in the flames.
The towering, dark Imperial crooned and raved.
With the same blow that will begin this war in earnest, I shall end it as well, a downward slope from which your weak government shall never recover. You and your dear blue pet, and all those who survive my games here, shall be the last of the Jedi. Your order will scream here, but it will die in the darkness of my cells, my labs, and my prison. I will pull you each apart, make you my own, and those who will not change, I shall discard as mere research material.
Now, realization of the true madness they faced struck the Jedi who remained, Voss and Ayla most of all.
You're completely insane!
Quinlan spat as the Inquisitor began to laugh again.
My insanity, as you call it, shall rule this universe. So I ask you again, Jedi Knight of the Feeble Republic, is this all you have? Is this the extent of the witch generals so vaunted, so feared, so disappointing? You have only one chance. Defeat me here, or watch your entire world, your whole universe, cease to exist.
Tarweiler prodded and hissed.
If those are my only choices, then I will defeat you!
Voss roared before snapping his head forward, headbutting Tarweiler on the bridge of his nose. It was like slamming his head into a steel wedge, but the Inquisitor recoiled, stunning him long enough for Voss to release his apprehended yellow lightsaber. Grasping his green blade in both hands and spinning into the sudden slack of the flame whip which held it, seeking to cleave the man in half with a strike. Tarweiler bent backwards in a way a body should not have been able to, the burning blade passing over him as he slid beneath. He came back around, the flame whip pulling the yellow lightsaber into his hand and using it to block the next strike Quinlan followed up with. Sparks flying as the bars of light struck each other and locked, both faces near behind them.
Better, Jedi! Better! But you will need more than that!
The Inquisitor admonished before releasing a growl of his own, pushing Quinlan away with a thrust of his own kidnapped blade, the two beginning a mortal exchange, darkness writhing in their shadows as their sabers collided again and again. Ayla wished she had that kind of strength, but alas, there was no hope left in her now. What ploy could she devise? What plan? What power? What tactic could she resort to when he could access her thoughts so easily and bend reality so readily? She was reminded of her first battle with General Grievous and of her own fall to the dark side. She was reminded of how easily he had defeated her earlier that same day, so many hours ago. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, she felt her faith in the Order shaken to its very core. Were they wrong? Was the Jedi Order wrong all of this time? Had they really fallen to such depths of weakness that they could do nothing against these monsters that continued to assail them? How was it possible that after all of this time, after all of her sacrifices, all of her trials, she was still so far behind? The face of Kit Fisto flashed through her mind, his bright smile, his comforting presence, his love. She and he had forsaken it, discarded those precious seeds of attachment to dedicate themselves further to the Jedi Order, the same order that had led them here, into this war, into this fight she could not win. How could Master Yoda have claimed what he claimed? Told her that the light could always vanquish darkness, as her mentor, her friend, her brother, fought with all he had, only to be slowly pushed back and crushed down. Voss and Wyler clashed repeatedly, again and again, blades of gold and green bleeding sparks with each touch, their speeds accelerating, and yet the distance between them never seeming to shrink for more than an instant. Moment by moment, Quinlan was growing stronger, but somehow, paradoxically, still losing ground. Every time he seemed to gain an advantage, reality would warp, and the Inquisitor would escape and counter with even more ferocity. With startling clarity, Ayla realized that she was going to watch him die, or that he would watch her die, or that they would both watch each other be dissected and pulled apart by this monster if he chose to take them alive. For he was the only one with any choice here, and she, as well as the defeated Jedi around her, dead or alive, were not able to impede his will beyond what he humored. Something deep within Ayla was crushed in that moment, and she knew it, and did not know if she would ever be able to heal it, or if she ever would desire to. Finally, the bout between the two furious Force wielders was ended, Tarweiler kicking Voss in the chest, and as the Jedi's arms flew out to either side, the Inquisitor swept down his stolen saber and cleaved through the wrist of his right hand. Ah! The Jedi cried out in pain before suddenly being lifted from the ground before he could fall, held within a tight, invisible grip. Tar lifted his own free hand, discarding the yellow saber with the other, his left hand curled and raising the constrained Jedi, being brought higher and higher into the air as he did. The crackle and pop of joints and bones being strained to their limit could be heard. Voss's arms spread to either side, his body pulled taut in every direction.
This is the end now. I have a ship to catch after all, and I still need to pack you all up. So let's see if we can't make you carry-sized.
The cruel creature crooned as he stepped forward, the fingers of his left hand closing a bit more, forcing a dire scream from Voss as he was stretched even more.
Let him go!
Ayla cried out, dropping her saber from her hand and opening her palms, issuing forth a thoughtless, emotional rush of power towards the two and throwing them both back. Tarweiler collided with one wall, while Quinlan Voss struck the other, the latter falling unconscious and sliding down, slumping there. while the former merely hissed and grunted as he was pinned against the steel at his back. Ayla held her arms out, eyes blazing, tears streaming down her face as she stepped closer and closer, with more and more force every second that passed.
You will take no one! You will take nothing! No more!
She spat at him, the tall, lanky body of the Inquisitor pressed flat against the makeshift prison's boundary like an insect pinned inside of a display case. He tilted his head back down to glare at her, eyes pitch black and glossy, sharpened teeth grit in a frustrated grimace. His right hand began to pry off from the wall, and then his left, before Ayla released a pained shout and shoved him back against the steel.
I said no more! I will stop you! I have to stop you!
She exclaimed, veins defined against her blue skin as she exerted herself like never before. Yet her surge of strength was only able to hold him down for so long, as she felt his own power rising to meet her like a boiling pot held under pressure, swelling his own repulsive strength under the press of her power, gradually prying himself off from the wall and landing on his feet again, his hands out and now pushing against her own. Ayla squinted her eyes as she tried to force him back, but the Inquisitor held his ground, robes billowing and tossing.
Impressive, Xenos,
the Imperial said through his grit teeth.
but not impressive enough!
He roared, opening his palms fully and thrusting his hands out wide. In response, his power exploded outward, and Ayla found herself thrown back, falling and rolling head over heels, regaining her stability as she kneeled against the maelstrom of his power. Blood streamed from her nose, senses entirely overwhelmed. The Inquisitor straightened, smoothing his robes with his hand, a slight glisten of sweat sheening his smooth bald face and head. He then looked up at her and smiled his demon smile.
A valiant effort. Let us see if we cannot replicate that in a lab setting.
He began to say, before pausing, his expression melting into one of annoyance as he turned around to face away from her. Ayla did not hear it at first, nor could she sense it, but soon the sound became loud enough for her to make it out. A steady, frantic clinking and clanking noise coming from up the stairs. The Inquisitor paused his approach, and he, as well as Ayla and the rest who remained conscious, turned their eyes upwards towards the bulky, shambling form of the tech priest known as Omni Kraden.
What is it?
Demanded Tarweiler, voice tinged with irritability.
We are
surrounded,
droned the odd Magos.
The Replicate are all around the area. Flying vessels have encircled us,
the tech priest reported.
They are no matter. I will flay their minds and the very skin from their bodies as soon as I am finished here,
pronounced the Inquisitor, but the Magos was shaking his head before the man had even finished.
Commissar Shadrick has reported
that he is nearing completion
of the activation of the bomb at the Basilica of
Salvation.
And, more immediately alarmingly, the Republic escorted something here.
An invader of some sort.
It's already inside the building.
The countermeasures I installed
cannot even slow it down.
Inquisitor,
we need to use the
machine man continued before suddenly losing his breath, or what he used in place of it, and rising up from the ground, metal legs kicking and scraping.
Kraden! Kraden, what is happening to you?
The Inquisitor shouted, stepping back and away from the now floating machine man, his black eyes slowly widening as his senses came awake to what his own power had been hiding from him. Slipping from the shadow of Tarweiler's arrogance, stepping down the stairs, one leisurely placed foot at a time, was another figure. Not as tall, and not as overtly monstrous as the Inquisitor, but black-robed and cloaked in a power which radiated out. Ayla saw her own breath fog in the air, suddenly cold in the presence of this new darkness. And as she watched the new figure descend, she knew without having to ask what it was. Omni Kraden choked and wheezed in mechanical fashion, struggling in the invisible grip that held him, clutching at the metallic piping that made up his throat. The robed figure held its hand out in a casual gesture, as though pinching a flea between its thin fingers, before just as casually rolling its wrist, throwing the Magos into the wall with enough force to break panels loose. Tar watched it all with grit teeth, his brow creasing as all humor left him.
That,
the Inquisitor hissed, his black rapier skidding from the ground and spinning into his hand,
was a mistake. That tech priest belonged to me and my War Master,
pronounced Tarweiler, but this new figure in black only chuckled within the dark confines of his hood and shook his head.
Oh no, my ambitious rival,
purred the voice of an elderly man.
You will find that it is you who are mistaken,
he continued, a pair of gold-plated handles sliding into either hand, shooting out from his long robe sleeves and into his waiting palms.
About a great many things,
pronounced the Dark Lord of the Sith. The handles ignited, extending out two glowing crimson blades of light, and darkness met darkness, ending Ayla's desperate fight. The wind was a lash against her aching skin, buffeting her and tossing her vestments and bandages about wildly. She kept her profile small, as slim as possible, and below she could see the shadowy shape of the virus bomb, falling more slowly than herself, yet still speeding for the ground. The borehole both Imperial weapons fell down through had been drilled past countless existing layers, some of them dark, some of them burgeoning with light. Those bands of light strafed them both, at times blinding Ishtara by their rapid arrival and passing. In one hand, she clutched her flamer pistol between broken fingers, her other hand extended out, reaching for the tail of the world-ending bomb. Her daughters, Saint Lazarus, her sisterhood, and all of those who depended upon them were constant thoughts in her mind, battling the agony of her ancient body. Suffering was her prayer, and her prayers were now stronger than ever. Fingers grasping the air, scraping the metal of the bomb for several seconds before she attained a grip and pulled herself closer. There were handholds, railings made to help scale and maintenance the weapon, which she now made use of, hooking bruised toes over them once she had dragged herself one-handed up one side of the tool of Exterminatus. She needed to reach the canisters and burn them out, carefully, one at a time, to even have a chance of stopping this, but her going was slow, if frantic. The bomb's descent was also less than controlled, scraping and bumping occasionally against the sides of the tunnel they fell down, each contact risking the fracturing of the viral vials that held the virus. If even one shattered before she could neutralize it, then her whole basilica was dead, if nothing else. But she kept the faith, as she always had, and continued to climb. Darkness and light moved past her in rapid succession, pain bleeding into every inch of her, her movements such a struggle that she began to lose track of time, lose track of even her own body. Ishtara was dizzy, sick with weakness, and yet still she crawled, using her free elbow to leverage herself, single hand grasping further and further. She clung to the weapon, crying out in pain as it skidded against the wall again, rattling her bones, breaking a few. But where her mind and body sought to surrender, her spirit refused to bow.
I will never submit, not even in the face of death.
She gasped, reminding the other two weaker parts of herself that failure was not an option. Retreat was not possible. And then, suddenly, there was no more railing. She opened reddened, teary eyes, weeping the wind from her sockets as the venerable mistress of the brides of the Emperor found herself at the lip to the opening in the bomb, the bright green canisters before her swirling their nefarious contents, not a single one broken yet. She hauled her weapon-bearing arm over and onto the seam, flamer sparking, ready to fire even now within this hurricane of falling wind. Now was the time. She would not allow the faith to fall. She would not allow so many faithful to die. Or so she thought, before the bomb scraped the side of the wall again, this time much closer to her. She screamed, Ishtara's lungs emptying themselves in raw agony as the bomb bumped the side of the tunnel again and pinched off her weapon-bearing arm, crushing half her body with it. The flamer flew away into the tunnel, along with the limb holding it, and Ishtara only stayed in place because of her other arm and the leg on the same side still hooked and anchored around the railing beneath her. The Canoness Superior tried to breathe, but blood slicked her lips, whipped away quickly by the wind and streaking her face with red. One of her lungs was entirely smashed and punctured, and the other could barely draw any breath at all. The world began to fade, the chill wind around her whistling, carrying away the last bits of heat that composed her life. Was this possible? She wondered as darkness encroached from all sides. Had she finally failed in this, her final task? With a deep and painful resignation, she was forced to admit that she had. Her body could take her no further. Her weapons were no longer with her. Her spirit was bleeding out of her, even now, and the floor was rushing up to meet the bomb and end the world. She had failed entirely, and so she did the only thing that she could do now. She put it all into the Emperor's hands. Her final task, unable to be completed by herself in any true capacity. And with the last breaths in her body, Ishtara Ordain prayed.
Oh, Emperor, I pray, hear me now, your loyal servant, in this, my final hour. All of my life I have sought to serve you, to carry out your will. Now I ask, if I truly have earned your favor for one last blessing.
The Canoness gasped, her words caught by the wind, but heard nonetheless.
Since the moment I understood your glory, I have wanted nothing more than to be a blade, a sword wielded by your almighty hand. I would have been happy to have been born as a divine storm, or a holy bolter, a mighty conflagration, or even a terrible hurricane, a sanctified force of nature without a heart or pity, able to perform your will and nothing more.
She called out, blood thick upon her lips, yet not intruding upon her final request. Her eyes blazed with gold, her struggling heart ceased to pump, and yet still her blood flowed. The shadow of a mighty hand fell over her soul, closing around it like the handle of a weapon, and squeezing tightly, holding it in place. Fire bled from her nostrils, blackening her blood and skin. Flames wept from her eyes, scorching her face. But suffering was her prayer, and all of it was expressed through her words.
So I pray, in this final moment, make of me a storm of fire, Make of me an instrument of your purest will. Turn my faith to wrath. Turn my wrath to service. And make my service true. If it is your will that we all die here, then let me be the first. If it is your will that we survive, then take my life and spare the others. So plead I, Ishtara ordain, first among your brides in waiting.
Her clothes caught fire, the torn stump of her arm now seeming to leak promethium in place of blood. Her tongue became a tongue of flame, her words echoing with a strength that was not her own. Her remaining hand began to melt into the surface of the bomb, the vials cracking in the growing heat.
So pray I, servant of the throne, in the Emperor's name.
And with those final words, a great blaze began, consuming Ishtara's mortal flesh and expanding out. The virus bomb struck the ground, its lethal payload released, but as soon as it tasted freedom, it was also consumed in fire. The blaze spread like a living explosion, consuming every molecule of the Death Eater virus and far, far more. By faith and by fury, the Emperor's hand descended over Axum and with a single golden thumb of fire, smothered the death of the world like a man might crush an ant. So ended the mortal life of Ishtara Ordain, Queen of Warriors, servant of the Golden Throne, and bride of the Emperor.
If this is true and in fire, then we should all burn together. Watch the flames climb high into the night. Call it out, Father, oh, stand by and we will watch the flames burn over on the mountainside. And if we should die tonight, then we should all die together. Raise a glass of wine for the last time. Call it out, Father, oh, prepare as we will watch the flames burn on and on the mountainside. Desolation comes upon the sky. Burning like a diamond in the dead of night. There's fire deep in my soul. I'ma rise up like the legends of old. Brighter than gold, brighter than gold. Brighter than gold, brighter than gold. Now my kingdom's coming, coming. I was born for the throne. Like lightning striking, sparking. There's heat in my bones. There's fire deep in my soul. I'ma rise up like the legends of old. Brighter than gold, brighter than gold. I can feel that fire in me, fire in me, fire. I can feel that fire in me, fire in me, fire. Yeah. Give me the fire. Give me the fire. I'm in the shadow of the valley of the gods in the graves. I'll keep on going, running, running. I'll go till my body breaks. There's fire deep in my soul. I'ma rise up like the legends of old. Brighter than gold, brighter than gold. I can feel that fire in me, fire in me, fire. I can feel that fire in me, fire in me, fire. Yeah. Give me that fire. Give me that fire. Burn on, I'm shining so bright. Lit up like a diamond in the dead of night. There's fire deep in my soul. I'ma rise up like the legends of old. Brighter than gold, brighter than gold.